There is a way to make another person come apart in front of you without raising your voice, your hand, or your heart rate, and by the end of this video, it will belong to you. 1993. A bare room at the University of Trier. A single chair and 3 people behind a table, given one instruction: show nothing. No nod, no frown. You walk in, you speak, and they give you a wall. And that wall alone, researchers found, drives one of the most reliable stress hormone surges ever measured in a laboratory. Not social awkwardness, not embarrassment. A measured flood of cortisol and adrenaline, because a room full of people who refuse to react to you is one of the most destabilizing things a human nervous system can experience. You already know that wall. You've stood on the wrong side of it. It took you apart, and you walked away, certain the people who can hold it were simply born colder than you. They weren't. They learned where you leak. Everyone who has ever gotten to you was doing the same thing, running a quiet bet on how you'd react, and feeding on the proof when you did. In this video, I'll show you the 7 exact places your body hands them that proof, how to seal everyone, and the moment their bet goes bad. The 7th is the one almost no one can hold. Give them nothing to read, and there's nothing left to run. We start with the bet itself. Your brain is not waiting for things to happen and then responding to them. It is constantly generating predictions about what comes next, running those predictions against incoming data, and updating the model when the data doesn't fit. Claim. That is the central finding in Lisa Feldman Barrett's work at Northeastern University, published in 2017. The brain is a prediction machine, not a reactor, and it is running this process continuously in every interaction you have, whether you're aware of it or not. Here is what that means for the person sitting across from you. If they've watched you respond to pressure before, even once they now own a fragment of your model, they know what input produces what output. They know that a particular kind of comment, delivered in a particular tone, at a particular moment, generates a particular reaction from you. And the next time they need something from you, they don't think about that consciously. They don't sit down and plan it. Their nervous system runs the model automatically, the same way yours predicts the next word in a sentence before you've read it. The behavior arrives because the pattern is already loaded. This is where B, F, clacked. Skinner's work becomes relevant, and not in the way it's usually taught. Skinner's variable reward schedule, developed through decades of behavioral research in the mid-20th century, found that the most durable conditioning isn't produced by consistent rewards. It's produced by intermittent ones. You don't need to react every time someone pushes. You only need to react sometimes, unpredictably, to keep the behavior alive, indefinitely. A slot machine pays out occasionally, and people pull the lever thousands of times because the occasional confirmation is enough to sustain the behavior. Your reaction is the payout, and you don't need to give it often. You just need to give it enough. The bet isn't malicious in most cases. It doesn't require planning. The person who keeps finding ways to get under your skin isn't necessarily scheming. They've simply learned, through trial and error, that a certain move produces a certain result from you, and their nervous system keeps running that move because it keeps getting funded. Stop funding it, and the model has to update. But here's the problem. Your nervous system is also running a model, and your model says that remaining composed under that kind of pressure is something other people can do, and you can't, because every time you've tried, the body has overridden you. That override has 7 exits, 7 places the signal leaves your body and enters their read. Not 7 emotional vulnerabilities, 7 physical locations where the data leaks out of your system and into theirs. The face, the breath, the voice, the posture, the timing of your responses, the signals your own body is sending you before you've consciously registered them, and the silence, or the absence of it. These aren't separate problems. They form one connected signal chain, and that chain matters because the people who are good at reading you don't rely on a single signal. They triangulate. Your face says one thing, your breath says another, and the gap between the two is louder than either one alone. Your reaction is data. No reaction is a data blackout. And a blackout, sustained long enough, breaks the model entirely. Not weakens it, breaks it. The person running the bet against you has never encountered a round where the payout simply didn't come. Not once, not even a flicker. And when that happens, something specific occurs inside their nervous system that we'll get to in detail. For now, understand that the 7 checkpoints are the 7 places they harvest, the confirmation that keeps the bet alive. Seal all 7, and there is nothing left to harvest. The next question is why sealing some of them and not others doesn't work, and the answer to that is the first thing you need to understand before we touch a single checkpoint. Picture someone who has done the reading. They know their face leaks, so they work on the face. They practice the neutral expression. They train themselves to hold it under mild pressure, and in low-stakes situations, it works. Then a real moment arrives, a public challenge, a loaded question, a move designed specifically to get through, and the face holds. The expression stays flat, but the breath climbs into the chest. And the person across from them doesn't need the face anymore. This is the core problem with partial sealing, and it's the reason most people who've tried to become harder to read have failed. They treated each checkpoint as a separate skill, fixed one, felt progress, and brought a body into the room that was leaking just as loudly as before, just from a different location. The people who are genuinely good at reading others don't look for one signal and call it done. They triangulate. They run multiple channels simultaneously and look for the relationship between them. A trained interrogator, a seasoned negotiator, an experienced therapist, none of them are watching your face in isolation. They're watching whether your face matches your breath, whether your breath matches your timing, whether your timing matches your posture. The read they're building is a coherence check. When everything aligns, the signal is clean, and they move on. When something doesn't fit, when the face says one thing and the body says another, that misalignment becomes the tell, not the leak itself. The gap between what's leaking and what's being controlled. This is what experienced readers call the coherence read, and it's more damaging than any single leak because it's additive. Every controlled signal that doesn't match an uncontrolled one confirms the read. You hold the face, but the breath climbs 1 point of confirmation. You hold the face and slow the breath, but the voice tightens 2 points. You hold the face, slow the breath, and keep the voice level. But you fill the silence in 4 seconds when your baseline is 8, 3 points. Each controlled channel that doesn't cover an uncontrolled one doesn't reduce their information. It increases it, because now they know exactly where your wall ends. This is why the 7 checkpoints have to be understood as a single system. Not 7 separate fixes applied in sequence, but one chain. Because that's how the signal actually moves through the body. The amygdala fires, the breath responds, the heart follows. The face reflects what the heart is doing. The voice carries what the face is trying to hide. The timing of your words reveals what the voice is covering, and the silence or your inability to hold it confirms everything the other 6 channels were broadcasting. Cut the chain at one link, and the signal reroutes. The chain stays intact. What you're building over the next sections is not a collection of skills. It's one wall, built from the inside out, starting at the source the moment the signal enters your body before you've consciously registered it. That's checkpoint 1. And it fires faster than you think. Watch a goalkeeper facing a penalty. The ball leaves the boot at over 80 miles an hour, and he is already moving, committed to a side before his conscious mind has registered which way it's traveling. He doesn't decide to dive. His body decides, and the decision arrives before he knows it was made. You run the same machinery every time someone lands a comment, with just enough edge that you can't be sure it was aimed at you. Before you've finished processing the words, before you've decided what they meant, your stomach has already dropped. Your jaw has already shifted. Something in your posture has already changed. You didn't choose any of that. It was already happening while you were still trying to work out what was said. That gap, the space between the comment landing and your conscious mind catching up, is where you lose, every time. Joseph Ledoux at New York University spent years mapping exactly what happens in that gap, and what he found overturned the way most people understand their own reactions. The amygdala, a small structure deep in the brain, receives threat signals through what Ledoux identified as a low road, a direct pathway from the sensory thalamus that bypasses the cortex entirely. The signal doesn't travel up to the thinking brain first, get evaluated, and then get sent back down as a physical response. It goes directly to the amygdala, which fires immediately, triggering the body's stress response faster than conscious sight. Before you've seen the threat clearly, your body has already begun responding to it. Before you know what happened, you've already reacted. This matters because it means the first leak isn't a choice. The micro-expression that crosses your face in the instant before you compose yourself is not a failure of discipline. It's the direct output of a subcortical circuit that operates below the level of awareness. The breath that catches in the throat, the slight postural shift, the momentary tension in the hands, all of it exits the body before the cortex has even received the information. You can't decide not to do it. The decision-making system hasn't been consulted yet. What Ledoux's work also shows is that this fast path processing is not precise. The amygdala is not evaluating nuance. It's pattern matching against stored threat signals and triggering the alarm when something close enough to a past threat arrives. The comment in the meeting doesn't have to actually be an attack. It just has to resemble one enough that the pattern activates. And the activation is immediate, physical and visible to anyone watching you at the moment it happens. Here's the part that should change how you think about this. You cannot stop the amygdala from firing. That's not the goal. The goal is the gap between when it fires and when the signal exits the body, because that gap exists. It's small, but it's there, and it's trainable. What Ledoux's research also established is that the amygdala's output doesn't go straight to the muscles without any modulation at all. There is a pathway back through the prefrontal cortex, a return loop that, when it's functioning, can catch the signal before it becomes a visible expression. The amygdala fires, the signal starts moving toward expression, and a functioning prefrontal brake can intercept it, not cancel it, not suppress it, intercept it early enough that the expression never fully forms. The detection gap is that intercept window. It's the time between the amygdala firing and the expression completing. And right now, for most people, that window is essentially zero, because they've never trained it, and because the prefrontal brake has its own problem, which we'll get to immediately. But here's what you need to hold first. The first checkpoint isn't the expression, it's the gap before the expression. The people who seem unreadable in high-pressure moments aren't people whose amygdalae don't fire. They're people whose intercept window is wide enough that the signal gets caught before it exits. That window is built through training. It is not a personality trait or a matter of temperament. It is a gap that exists in the architecture of every human nervous system, and it responds to specific kinds of work. The first thing standing between you and that gap is a system that stress specifically disables, and understanding that system is what comes next. The prefrontal cortex is the brake. It sits right behind your forehead, and its job, among other things, is to receive the amygdala's alarm signal and decide whether to let it run or catch it. When it's working, it's the difference between a flicker and a flood. When it's not working, the flood runs unopposed, and everything exits the body at once. Here's the problem. The same conditions that trigger the amygdala also degrade the prefrontal cortex. Amy Arnston at Yale, writing in Nature Review's Neuroscience in 2009, documented what happens to prefrontal function under acute stress. Cortisol and norepinephrine, the stress hormones released the moment the amygdala fires, directly suppress the prefrontal cortex, not gradually, not after sustained exposure. Immediately, in proportion to the intensity of the threat signal. The stronger the alarm, the less available the brake. The system that's supposed to intercept the reaction is taken partially offline by the very event it's supposed to manage. So when someone tells you to calm down in a high-pressure moment, here's what they're actually asking. They're asking the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that stress has already partially escorted out of the building, to reach back into the system, override the amygdala's output, and produce a composed response. That order is not hard to follow. It is structurally impossible to follow well, because the hardware required to execute it is compromised by the conditions under which it's needed most. This is not a character flaw. It is not a failure of willpower. It is architecture. The human stress response was not designed for conference rooms or negotiation tables. It was designed for environments where the thing triggering the alarm could actually kill you, where the two most useful responses were to fight it or run from it, and where anything resembling careful deliberation was a liability. In those environments, taking the prefrontal cortex offline under threat was adaptive. It cleared the channel for fast physical response. The problem is that the architecture doesn't distinguish between a predator and a pointed question. The alarm fires, the brake degrades, and the body runs its threat protocol on whoever is sitting across from you. This is what an amygdala hijack actually is, not a metaphor. A literal routing of behavioral output away from cortical control. The signal bypasses the deliberate system entirely and goes straight to expression, posture, voice, breath. Every physical channel simultaneously. You watch yourself react. You observe it happening from somewhere slightly behind your own eyes, with no ability to intercept it, because the system that would do the intercepting is already suppressed. People who've experienced this in a high-stakes moment know exactly what it feels like. The words are already out. The expression has already shifted, and the cortex comes back online just in time to watch the aftermath. The gap between the amygdala firing and the prefrontal brake engaging is not fixed. That is the entire point. Arnstein's research identifies the degradation mechanism, but the research on training, which we'll reach in detail, makes clear that the baseline strength of the prefrontal brake and the baseline level of cortisol required to suppress it are both changeable. A prefrontal cortex that has been trained is harder to take offline. An amygdala that fires with less intensity requires less cortisol to manage it. The window doesn't just exist, it widens with the right kind of work. But the work happens before the room, not during it. In the room, with the hormones already running and the cortex already compromised, you're spending whatever you built before you walked in. If you built nothing, you have nothing to spend. That's what the training sections are for, and we'll get there. First, you need to understand every place the signal exits, because you can't seal what you haven't located. The next leak is the one most people think they're managing. They're not. Picture a courtroom. A lawyer is cross-examining a witness, and the witness knows the answer they're about to give is going to be challenged. Watch the chest. Before the witness speaks a single word, the breath has already moved up out of the belly into the upper chest. Shallower, faster, each inhale slightly audible. The lawyer doesn't need to hear the answer. The breath already told them everything about how defensible it is. The breath is the most visible autonomic signal your body produces, and it is the one people are most convinced they're managing when they aren't. You can decide to hold your face still. You can concentrate on your posture. But the breath responds to the nervous system directly, automatically, and continuously, and because it's continuous, it broadcasts state in real time, not just in the moment of a reaction, but across the entire duration of a conversation. 3 things change in the breath under stress, and all 3 are readable from across a table. The rate increases, the depth decreases, and the location shifts from the diaphragm into the chest. Each of these changes signals something specific to anyone who's paying attention. A faster rate confirms arousal. A shallower breath confirms the body is prioritizing speed over depth, which is a threat response. And chest breathing, specifically, is not just a symptom of sympathetic activation, it is also a driver of it. The mechanics work in both directions. A high chest breath triggers the sympathetic nervous system, which increases arousal, which drives faster, shallower chest breathing. The body locks itself into the loop, and the loop is visible the entire time it's running. Stephen Porges, then at the University of Maryland, proposed the polyvagal theory in 1995, a framework that remains debated, but one that drew attention to a relationship the underlying physiology already supports: the link between the breath and the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the primary cable of the parasympathetic nervous system. It runs from the brainstem down through the heart, the lungs, and the gut, and it is the mechanism through which the body shifts between threat states and regulated states. Here's the critical detail. The breath is the only voluntary handle on that nerve. Every other parasympathetic function operates below conscious reach. Heart rate, digestive activity, the dilation of blood vessels. You cannot decide to slow your heart directly. You cannot instruct your gut to relax. But you can control the breath, and the breath controls the nerve, and the nerve controls all of it. One wire, the only wire you hold. What the physiology makes clear is that slow diaphragmatic breathing doesn't feel calming because of some vague psychological effect. It produces a direct, mechanical increase in vagal tone, the baseline activity level of the vagus nerve, which pulls the autonomic system toward the parasympathetic side, with the same reliability that a particular drug dose produces, a particular chemical effect. This is not a relaxation practice. It is a physiological intervention with a specific mechanism, and it works every time the mechanics are applied correctly. There's a second dimension to the breath that most people miss entirely. The breath is the signal others most readily synchronize to, below their own awareness. Elaine Hatfield's research on emotional contagion, which we'll examine in full at Checkpoint 6, found that humans unconsciously entrain to the physical signals of people around them. The breath is one of the earliest and most consistent signals in that process. When you slow your breath in a tense room, you are not just regulating your own system, you are quietly setting the pace for everyone in it. The room doesn't know it's following your lead, it just does. And the person trying to read you, whose own nervous system is already beginning to mirror your outputs, finds themselves receiving a regulated signal instead of a stressed one. Their model starts running on bad data before you've said a word. The breath is the most trainable checkpoint. It responds immediately to conscious intervention and builds durable baseline changes with consistent practice. The checkpoint beneath it is harder because it doesn't announce itself the way the breath does. You can see breath, you cannot see what comes next. Two people walk into the same negotiation, same preparation, same information, same opening position. One of them sits down and the room shifts not toward them exactly, but around them, the way furniture arranges itself around a weight. The other sits down and the room waits, not hostilely, just waits. Nobody in that room can explain why. Nobody looked at a readout or ran a calculation. They felt it. And what they felt was measurable, coming off the body before either person had spoken a word. What they were reading, without knowing it, was heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is not your heart rate. It's the variation between individual heartbeats. A heart beating at 60 beats per minute is not beating once per second, evenly, like a metronome. There is natural fluctuation, each beat slightly earlier or later than a perfectly regular interval, and the size of that fluctuation is a direct measure of vagal tone. High variability means the brake is engaged and responsive. Low variability means the system is running hard and the brake is losing. Julian Thayer, then at the National Institute on Aging, and Richard Lane at the University of Arizona, published a model of neurovisceral integration in the Journal of Affective Disorders in 2000, synthesizing the research on HRV and behavioral control. And what they found was this: people with higher resting heart rate variability recover from emotional disruption faster, show stronger inhibitory control under pressure, and produce more flexible, calibrated responses when conditions change. The brake isn't just a metaphor. It has a measurement, and it predicts, with meaningful reliability, how a person performs when the pressure arrives. Here's why this matters for a room full of people who haven't touched a heart rate monitor. HRV doesn't stay inside the body. It shapes every outward signal you produce. The timing of your vocal responses, how long you pause before answering, whether you interrupt, whether you trail off, is partly a function of the nervous system's current regulatory state, which HRV tracks. The prosody of your voice, meaning the rhythm and pitch variation in normal speech, is modulated by the same vagal pathways. Micro movements carry it too. The slight adjustments of head position, the timing of eye contact, the almost imperceptible postural shifts that happen dozens of times per minute, all marked with the fingerprint of the underlying regulatory state. None of this is decoded consciously by the people around you. They process it implicitly, the same way they process the breath. But the read accumulates, and the person who walked into that negotiation room and made it shift was producing coherent, regulated signals across all of those channels simultaneously, because their vagal tone was high enough to keep the system running cleanly. Low HRV has its own signature, and it's equally readable. Responses that come too quickly before the other person has fully finished speaking signal an overloaded system searching for exits. Responses that arrive too slowly, with that slight lag where the machinery is clearly working to produce something composed, signal suppression, which is its own tell. The voice loses its lower register and moves into the upper range. The body holds still in the wrong way, not the settled stillness of a regulated system, but the rigid stillness of something actively restraining itself. These are all different expressions of the same underlying condition, a brake that isn't strong enough for the load being applied. The useful thing about HRV is that it's trainable, not over years, over weeks. The mechanism responds to consistent load, specifically to the repeated cycle of controlled stress, followed by deliberate recovery, which strengthens the vagal brake, the same way resistance training strengthens a muscle. The brake you build in those cycles is the brake you bring into the room. We'll get into the exact training protocol in the building section, because the method matters, and the sequence matters. For now, hold this. Vagal tone is not invisible, it is not fixed, and it is not the same as appearing calm. It is the structural condition that makes composure possible without effort, and effort, as the next checkpoint will show, is the most dangerous signal of all. A senior executive is delivering bad news to his team. The words are measured, the tone is steady. He's prepared for this conversation, rehearsed the key points, and he knows exactly what he wants the room to take away. Watch his face while he speaks. The mouth is doing what he told it to do. The jaw is set. The expression is neutral. The affect is professional. But something around the eyes is wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just off. A flicker of something that doesn't match the rest. A tightening that lasts less than a second and then disappears back into the composed surface. Nobody in the room can name what they saw, but everyone in the room felt it. And the message they walked away with was not the one he prepared. That flicker is not a failure of concentration. It is the output of a neural system he has no direct access to. In 1984, William Wren published a review in Psychological Bulletin that drew a line most people don't know exists. Voluntary facial expressions are controlled by the pyramidal motor system, routed through the cortex. These are the ones you deliberately produce. The smile for a photograph, the neutral expression you held in that meeting. Involuntary emotional expressions, the ones that cross your face when something actually registers, are controlled by the extrapyramidal system, a separate pathway that doesn't pass through conscious control at all. Two systems, one face, key, and they don't always agree. Wren's evidence for this came partly from neurology. Patients with damage to the pyramidal system could still produce spontaneous emotional expressions. They'd laugh at something funny, flinch at something startling, yet they couldn't voluntarily move the same muscles on command. Patients with extrapyramidal damage showed the opposite. They could pose expressions deliberately, but lost spontaneous emotional movement. The systems were literally separable by injury. They run in parallel, they use overlapping muscles, and when they fire at different times, when genuine emotion arrives slightly before the voluntary mask goes up, the face shows both. Briefly, in sequence, Paul Ekman and Wallace Friesen named what that sequence looks like from the outside. Microexpressions, genuine emotional signals lasting as little as 1/25th of a second, appearing in the window between the extrapyramidal output and the moment the voluntary system engages to cover it. In 2008, Stephen Porter and Leanne Ten Brinke at Dalhousie University ran a study on high-stakes deception, examining video footage of subjects attempting to mask genuine emotional reactions. What they found was that the true expression leaked consistently in that gap, not always visibly to an untrained observer, but present in the footage, frame by frame, before the controlled expression arrived to replace it. The face was running two programs. The gap between them was the tell. Here is the part that matters most for what you're building. You cannot suppress the involuntary face through concentration. Every study that has examined facial suppression under genuine emotional load finds the same result. Attempting to hold the face still increases sympathetic activation, which intensifies the underlying emotional signal, which gives the extrapyramidal system more to express. The effort of suppression is itself a signal. Trained readers don't just see the micro-expression, they see the effort around it. The over-controlled stillness that sits on top of a moving signal, the way a hand pressed over a speaker, doesn't silence it. The pressure is still audible. The only exit from this is upstream. If the amygdala fires with less intensity, the extrapyramidal system has less signal to carry. The involuntary face has less to express because the event generating the expression has been partially defused before it arrives. This is not about learning to produce better fake expressions. It's about reducing what's real enough that the two systems stop disagreeing. When they agree, when the voluntary and involuntary faces are carrying the same signal because the underlying state is genuinely regulated, the face becomes coherent. And a coherent face gives a reader nothing to triangulate against. That reduction happens at the upstream layer. And the upstream layer is inside you, earlier than the face, earlier than the breath, at the level of the system that reads your own body, before anyone else gets the chance. You're mid-sentence in a conversation that matters. You're making a point, holding the thread, and then something arrives. A heat in the chest, a tightening low in the throat, a pressure behind the eyes that wasn't there 10 seconds ago. You don't know if it's anger or anxiety. You can't tell if the feeling is a signal you should act on or noise you should discard. And while you're trying to sort that out, 2 seconds pass, maybe 3. The face has already moved. The voice has already changed. Whatever that signal was, it left the body before you understood it. That ambiguity is not a sensitivity problem. It is an interoception problem. Interoception is the brain's continuous read of the body's internal state, heart rate, gut tension, chest pressure, temperature, muscle load across the trunk and jaw and hands. It runs underneath conscious awareness most of the time, feeding raw data upward into a region of the cortex called the anterior insula, which is where those raw signals get processed into what you eventually experience as a felt emotion. The anterior insula is not the engine, it's the instrument panel. It takes the noise coming off the heart and the lungs and the gut and converts it into the gauge you're reading when you say the words, "I feel anything at all." A.D. Craig at the Barrow Neurological Institute published a review in Nature Reviews Neuroscience in 2009, mapping exactly how this conversion happens. The signal chain runs from the body's internal organs through a specific pathway in the spinal cord, up to the brainstem, and then to the insula, where it becomes conscious. What Craig's work clarified is that the lag between the body event and the conscious read is not fixed. It varies with the precision and efficiency of the pathway, and that precision differs meaningfully between people. Some people receive a clear, early read. Others receive it late, degraded, or mixed together with other signals so thoroughly that what arrives is just a general sense of disturbance, with no useful label attached. Hugo Critchley, then at University College London, published research in Nature Neuroscience in 2004 that directly tested whether this variation mattered behaviorally. It did. Individuals with higher interoceptive accuracy, measured by how precisely they could track their own heartbeat without touching themselves, showed faster and more precise emotional regulation under pressure. They caught the signal earlier in its trajectory, which gave them more time and more options for how to handle it. The ones with lower accuracy didn't feel less. They felt later. By the time the signal registered clearly enough to act on, it had already completed its journey through the face, the voice, and the posture. The read arrived after the leak. This is the checkpoint that sits between all the others. The amygdala fires and sends a signal outward. The breath responds. The heart follows. The face and voice carry the output. But before any of that becomes a problem you're managing from the outside, there is a moment, brief, but real, where the signal is inside you and hasn't fully committed to an exit yet. Interoception is the capacity to catch it there, not to suppress it, not to decide it isn't happening. To read it accurately and early enough that you're routing it rather than chasing it. Poor interoceptors spend high-stakes moments one step behind their own bodies. The signal exits, they register the exit, and then they try to recover. Good interoceptors catch the signal at the instrument panel before it reaches the face. The difference isn't emotional sensitivity, it's signal timing. Training interoception is specific and it's quiet. It doesn't require a high-stress environment. It requires the opposite enough stillness that the body's signals become audible before they're amplified by a real threat. We'll get to the drill in detail. What matters now is the direction this points. The earlier you intercept the signal, the less there is to manage at the surface. Which brings the question to what happens when you manage it well enough that the other person gets nothing because what they do with nothing is the next thing you need to understand. A manager walks into a team meeting. He's been in a difficult conversation 20 minutes before, and it didn't go well. He doesn't mention it. He sits down, opens his notes, and starts the meeting normally. 4 minutes later, the room has changed. The people around the table are quieter than they were before he arrived. Responses are shorter. Someone who was animated in the hallway is now watching the table. Nobody can point to the moment it shifted. Nothing was said. But something moved from one person to the others and settled into the room like a change in air pressure. What moved was his state, and it moved automatically, through a mechanism that operates below the awareness of everyone involved. Elaine Hatfield, at the University of Hawaii, working with John Cacioppo and Richard Rapson, published research in 1993, establishing the mechanics of emotional contagion. What they found was that humans continuously and unconsciously mimic the facial expressions, posture, and vocal tone of the people around them, and that this mimicry is not decorative. The physical imitation produces the corresponding internal state. You copy the expression, and you begin to feel what the expression encodes. The face leads, and the feeling follows. This process doesn't require attention or intention. It runs beneath deliberate processing, faster than conscious observation, and it runs continuously across the entire duration of any shared space. So when the manager walked in carrying a stressed autonomic state, breath elevated, vagal tone low, micro movements tight, the people around him weren't analyzing him. Their bodies were copying him. Their faces made small, unconscious adjustments toward his expression. Their breath entrained slightly toward his rate. Their nervous systems began running a version of his state, and 4 minutes later, the room felt what he felt, without knowing why. You are not just broadcasting your internal state, you are installing it. Every signal that exits your body through the face, the breath, the timing of your movements, the prosody of your voice is received by the nervous systems of everyone in the room and partially reproduced inside them. When you leak, they catch it. When you're regulated, the room receives that signal instead and reproduces a version of it. This is not a social phenomenon. It is a biological one, running through the same mirror systems that allow humans to learn by observation, and it operates whether you're trying to influence the room or not. Here is where this flips into something you can use directly. The mechanism runs in both directions with equal reliability. A regulated nervous system broadcasting stable signals doesn't just fail to infect the room with distress, it actively pulls the room toward a regulated state. The person trying to destabilize you in that room is attempting to trigger a contagion cascade. Get a reaction from you. Watch it spread. Use the social energy it creates to confirm and amplify the pressure. Your composure interrupts that cascade at the source. And there's a layer beyond that. When the person trying to read you gets nothing to mirror, no elevated breath to entrain to, no facial signal to copy, no vocal pattern that encodes stress, their own nervous system is left working with a gap. They expected a specific input and received a different one. The mirror system has nothing to run on that matches the model. The mirror system, 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 the mirror system. That mismatch generates its own signal inside them, a low-level dissonance that they can't name and can't locate. They feel it as unease, as the slightly off sensation of a read that isn't resolving, of a pattern that isn't completing. That unease is not incidental. It is the first crack in the model. And the checkpoint that deepens it most is the one that doesn't look like a signal at all because it's the complete absence of one. A researcher sits across from a 6-month-old infant. She's been warm and responsive for several minutes, tracking the baby's gaze, mirroring its sounds, smiling when it smiles. The infant is calm, engaged, reaching toward her. Then, on a prearranged signal, the researcher's face goes completely still. Not hostile, not cold in any aggressive way, simply still, unresponsive. A face that gives nothing back. Within 60 seconds, the infant has exhausted its entire behavioral repertoire trying to recover the response. It reaches toward her. It points. It vocalizes with increasing urgency. cycling through every social signal it owns. When none of them work, it withdraws, turns away, drops its head, shuts down. The distress in that withdrawal is physiologically measurable. Cortisol rises, heart rate destabilizes. The body treats the absence of the expected response as an emergency. Edward Tronick, then at Harvard Medical School, introduced this paradigm in 1978. And what made it so consequential wasn't the observation that infants find it distressing. It was the mechanism it revealed. The still face wasn't cruel. It wasn't threatening. It didn't introduce anything harmful. All it did was withdraw predicted responsiveness. And the nervous system of the person facing it treated that withdrawal as a crisis, requiring immediate resolution. Now here's where this stops being about infants. The still face paradigm has been replicated with adults in modified forms, and the core finding holds. When a person expects a response and receives a neutral, unreadable face instead, the nervous system generates the same escalation cascade, scaled to adult social stakes. They repeat themselves. They rephrase. They shift tactics, try different angles, increase intensity. The specific signals change. The mechanism is identical. An expected input failed to arrive, and the system is now working hard to produce it, because a nervous system that cannot get a read on the person in front of it is a nervous system in distress. This is the exact mechanism your composure exploits. When someone has been getting a reaction out of you, they've built an expectation of responsiveness. Your expression confirms their move landed. Your shift in posture tells them the pressure is working. Your voice tighter, faster, slightly higher confirms the model. Every one of those signals is the social equivalent of the researcher's warm, tracking face. It tells them the system is responsive, the input is producing output, the bet is paying. Your stillness is not the absence of a response. It is the withdrawal of predicted responsiveness, and their nervous system responds to that withdrawal, the same way the infant responded, not with acceptance, but with escalation. They push again, harder. They rephrase the provocation with more edge. They try a different angle. The behavioral repertoire exhausts itself against a face that gives it nothing to work with. What fills the silence is almost always the thing they were trying to conceal. The person who came into the interaction with a clear agenda and a well-practiced move finds themselves overplaying it, revealing the urgency behind it, showing more of the position they were trying to hide than they would have if you'd simply reacted on schedule. The escalation exposes them. Your stillness didn't make them do it. Their own nervous system's need for resolution did, and you just refused to provide the resolution it was counting on. Hold this distinction clearly, because it matters for everything that follows. The still face is not coldness. It is not performing indifference or manufacturing a blank expression. A frozen face is suppression, and suppression leaks, as we've already established. What you're producing when the wall is built correctly is a face that has nothing to suppress, because the upstream signal has been managed at the level of the amygdala, the breath, and the vagal tone, and what arrives at the surface is simply a system running at baseline. The face is consistent because the state is consistent, and a consistently regulated face held against someone's escalating need for a reaction is not passive. It is an active withdrawal of the data their system cannot survive without. And the final checkpoint is the delivery mechanism for all of it. A negotiator is sitting across from the other side of a deal. They've just heard the final offer. It came in lower than expected, delivered with the confidence of someone who believes the number will hold. The negotiator doesn't frown, doesn't counter. 3. Doesn't shift in his chair or reach for his notes. He simply stops. 4 seconds pass. Then 5. The silence sits in the room like something physical, and the person who made the offer begins to talk, not to clarify, to revise. The number moves before the negotiator has said a single word, because the silence alone was more pressure than the other side could hold. That is not a technique. That is a trained capacity. And it is the rarest one in this entire stack. In 2014, Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia published research in the journal Science, examining what people do when left alone with their thoughts. Participants were placed in a bare room with no phone, no book, no task, and asked to sit quietly for between 6 and 15 minutes. The experience was so aversive that 67% of the male participants chose to administer electric shocks to themselves rather than continue sitting in silence. They chose physical pain over an empty room, not because they were distressed or anxious coming in, because the untrained nervous system finds unstructured silence genuinely unbearable, not metaphorically, not philosophically, but at the level of what the brain will do to escape it. Silence is not neutral. It is a data vacuum, and the brain treats a data vacuum as a problem, requiring immediate resolution. The nervous system is a prediction machine, as we established at the start, and a prediction machine with no incoming signal is a prediction machine generating error. It needs something to process. It will produce something to fill the gap if nothing arrives from outside, and in a social context, that production takes the form of words, disclosure, revision, concession. The other person talks, not because they've decided to, but because their nervous system cannot tolerate the alternative. Jared Curhan at MIT Sloan published research in the Journal of Applied Psychology in 2022, examining strategic silence in negotiation contexts. Specifically, what he found was that deliberate silence, pauses held after an offer or a demand, produced measurable improvements in final outcomes. The silence transferred psychological pressure from one party to the other, without a single word changing hands. The person who could hold the gap longer walked out with a better position, not because they argued more effectively, but because they let the other side's nervous system argue against itself. The seventh checkpoint is the hardest, because it requires something the other 6 don't. The breath drill is active. The body scan is active. The reappraisal is active. Silence asks you to do nothing, and doing nothing, when every social instinct you have is telling you to fill the space, is the most demanding thing on this list. The discomfort of not responding is real. It is physiologically real, in exactly the way Wilson's research shows. Your nervous system is generating the same aversive signal the person across from you is generating. The difference is whether you've trained the tolerance for it or whether you haven't. The person who breaks first has handed over their position. Not necessarily because of what they say, though. What they say usually confirms everything, but because the act of breaking confirms that the silence was unbearable to them and not to you. That asymmetry is the data. It tells the room who is running at baseline and who is running at capacity. It tells them whose model is intact and whose is straining. 4 seconds of silence, held cleanly, communicates something about your regulatory state that no prepared statement could replicate. You've now got all 7, the detection gap, the breath, the vagal tone, the 2 faces, the instrument panel, the still face, and the silence. 7 exits the signal uses to leave your body and enter their read. 7 places the data flows out and the bet gets confirmed. What happens when every one of them is sealed, simultaneously, against someone who has been running their model on you for months, is what comes next. Think about the last time someone had a reliable move on you. Not a dramatic one. Something quieter. A comment delivered at a specific moment. A particular tone used in front of a particular audience. A question framed just carefully enough to put you on the back foot. They used it, it worked, and the next time they needed leverage, they used it again. Because it worked again. And somewhere in the repetition, the behavior stopped being a choice they made consciously and became something the nervous system simply ran the way you reach for a light switch in a dark room without thinking about it. The pattern became automatic because you kept confirming it. Now, picture the day the confirmation doesn't come. In 1997, Wolfram Schultz, then at the University of Fribourg, working with Peter Dayan and Reed Montague, published research in the journal Science that mapped exactly what happens inside the brain when a predicted reward fails to arrive. They were studying dopamine neurons in primates, and what they found was precise enough to change how neuroscience understood motivation entirely. When an animal received a reward it had been conditioned to expect, the dopamine neurons did something unexpected. They didn't fire at the reward. They fired at the signal that predicted it, the cue that came before. The reward itself had been absorbed into the prediction. What the system was actually tracking was whether the world was behaving the way it expected. Then they removed the reward, gave the cue, waited. The dopamine neurons didn't just fail to fire at the moment the reward was due. They went below their baseline firing rate. A negative signal, an error signal, a neurological announcement that the model was wrong. That signal is a prediction error. And a prediction error is not a neutral observation. It is an urgent demand for resolution. Here is what that means for the person who just ran their move on you and got nothing. Their nervous system had built a model. Your reaction is the reward the cue predicts. The cue was the move. The predicted reward was your expression shifting, your voice tightening, your composure breaking in whatever specific way it has broken before. When none of that arrives, the dopamine circuit doesn't register the absence calmly. It fires a prediction error signal that the brain treats as a problem, requiring immediate correction. The person across from you is now running an error state. They don't experience it as, my strategy failed. They experience it as a pressure, a wrongness, an itch the interaction hasn't scratched. And the brain's first response to that itch is not to question the model. It's to run the behavior that generated the prediction harder. Carl Friston at University College London, writing in Nature Review's Neuroscience in 2010, described the brain's response to persistent prediction error in terms of two options. The first is to update the model, accept that the world has changed, and rebuild the prediction from new data. 2. The second is to increase the behavior that generated the prediction in the hope that a stronger input produces the expected output. Close quote. Updating the model is expensive. It requires dismantling something the brain has built over repeated confirmations and constructing something new from scratch. The brain resists this. It will almost always try the second option first. Run the behavior harder. Push the input higher. Escalate. This escalation is not aggression in any meaningful sense. It is a nervous system executing the only correction it knows. And it is predictable, down to its timing, its intensity, and its endpoint, because a prediction error signal cannot sustain indefinitely without a reward. The loop has a ceiling. The escalation has a terminal point, and that terminal point has a name, and understanding it is the difference between reading what's happening and misreading it as a sign you've already lost. The name is the extinction burst. And it is the most important moment in this entire sequence because it arrives looking exactly like failure, right before everything breaks in your favor. Dorothea Lerman and Brian Iwata published research in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in 1995, documenting a pattern that behavioral scientists had observed repeatedly, but rarely named cleanly. Just before a conditioned behavior dies, it often spikes. The organism that has been reinforced for a particular action and then suddenly isn't, doesn't quietly accept the new condition. It does the action harder, faster, with more intensity than it has ever produced before. One final push, as if volume alone might recover the missing confirmation. This spike is the extinction burst. It is not a sign that the behavior is strengthening. It is the last output of a system that is about to go offline. You need to have this concept installed before the room, not during, before. Because here is what the extinction burst looks like from inside a real interaction, without the framing. You've held composure through 3 rounds of provocation. The first one landed, and you gave nothing. The second came slightly harder, and you gave nothing again. The third arrived with a sharper edge, framed differently, and you still held. And then the fourth one comes, and it is not like the others. It's louder, more direct. The framing is gone, and what's underneath it is exposed. The comment is more pointed than anything they've tried before, delivered with an urgency that feels different, aimed more precisely at the specific thing they've learned is your weak point. And every instinct you have reads this as evidence that holding isn't working, that you've miscalculated, that the silence made it worse, not better. That red is wrong. That moment is the burst. That escalation is the dopamine prediction error signal, reaching its maximum intensity before it collapses. And the only thing standing between you and the collapse of their model is whether you hold through it or whether you give them the one confirmation their system is screaming for. Most people break here, not because they're weak, because the burst was designed by the architecture of the nervous system not by any conscious strategy to feel exactly like the moment to cut losses and respond. The intensity communicates urgency. The urgency communicates that something has changed. Nothing has changed. The model is dying, and dying systems make noise. The break at the burst is the single most expensive mistake in this entire practice, for a reason that goes beyond the current interaction. When you respond at the burst, you don't just end the hold, you teach them something specific and durable. That 3 rounds of composure plus 1 escalation equals a reaction. The new model they build from that data is worse than the original. Now they know the dosage. They know exactly how much pressure to apply to get through the wall. The wall they thought you'd built turns out to have a ceiling, and they know precisely where it is, because you showed them. Hold through the burst, and the opposite happens. The prediction error signal runs without resolution until the brain has no choice but to do what Friston described as the expensive option. Update the model. Accept that the cue no longer predicts the reward. And once the model updates, the behavior doesn't just pause, it loses its fuel source. The nervous system stops generating the impulse, because the impulse has been delinked from its expected outcome. The behavior extinguishes. The burst is survivable. It's survivable not through gritting teeth and white-knuckling the moment, but through having built the wall before you walked in, so that the escalation doesn't find a gap to push through. The intensity of the burst is proportional to how many confirmations the model accumulated before you stopped providing them. A deeply trained model bursts harder. It also collapses more completely when it goes, because the more confirmations it required to build, the more the brain has to dismantle when the model fails. The harder the escalation, the closer the end. The collapse doesn't arrive the way you'd expect. There's no confrontation, no acknowledgement, no moment where they look across at you and concede the point. What happens is quieter than that, and if you're not watching for it, you'll miss it entirely. They just stop, not all at once. Over 1, 2, maybe 3 interactions after the burst, the move simply doesn't appear. The comment they used to make doesn't get made. The angle they relied on doesn't get run. The energy they brought into your shared space, that particular quality of attention, slightly elevated, slightly pointed, goes flat. And the flatness is so different from what you'd grown used to, that it registers almost as an absence before it registers as a change. What happened inside them is not a decision. That's the part most people misunderstand. They didn't reflect on the situation and choose a different approach. Their nervous system stopped generating the impulse. The dopamine prediction circuit, which had been funding the behavior every time it ran, providing the anticipatory signal that made the move feel worth attempting, ran the cue one time too many, without a reward, and delinked the two. The cue still exists. The behavior still exists, somewhere in the repertoire. But the circuit that connected them and made the behavior feel compelling has gone quiet. And here's what that silence produces on their end, because it's not neutral. Schultz's research on prediction error established that a failed prediction doesn't just result in the absence of a dopamine signal. It produces a signal below baseline, an aversive signal, a mild but real discomfort that gets associated with the conditions under which the failure occurred. The behavior that used to feel rewarding doesn't now feel neutral. It feels slightly wrong. The move that used to produce a satisfying output now produces something closer to friction, and the nervous system routes away from friction the way water routes away from a slope. This is why people who lose the ability to read someone often avoid them entirely. The interaction itself has become associated with the prediction failure, with that specific discomfort of a model that keeps not resolving. You haven't done anything to them in any direct sense. You've simply become the environment in which their system repeatedly doesn't work, and the nervous system marks that environment as one to approach carefully, if at all. The status transfer that follows is durable in a way that an argument never produces. If you'd beaten them in a direct exchange, said something sharp, landed a point, won a visible round, they'd have a specific loss to analyze and a specific adjustment to make. The model would still be intact, just updated. What you've done instead is made the model itself unreliable. They no longer have a working read on how you respond, what moves on you, what you're likely to do next. And a person the nervous system can't model is a person the nervous system treats with something close to wariness, not fear, exactly, but the specific caution you extend to a surface you've fallen off before. You didn't announce the change. You didn't tell the room what happened. But the room noticed anyway, because the shift in how they approach you is visible to everyone who has been watching the dynamic, and the read updates automatically. The people around you adjust their model of you based on the behavior of the person who stopped. That adjustment costs you nothing and belongs to you permanently. The question now is how you build the wall that makes all of this possible. And the answer starts with the most common mistake people make when they try. Clear. Here is what everyone tries first. They walk into the room, telling themselves to stay calm. They've identified the move. They know it's coming, and they've decided, consciously and deliberately, that this time they won't give the person what they want. They'll hold the expression steady. They'll keep the voice flat. They'll refuse to react, and then the move lands. And the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executing that plan, is running at somewhere between 40 and 60% of its normal capacity, because cortisol and norepinephrine, released the moment the social threat registered, have already begun suppressing it. Amy Arnsten at Yale published research in Nature Review's Neuroscience in 2009, establishing the mechanism precisely. Under acute stress, the neurochemical changes that prepare the body for a physical threat actively degrade higher cortical function. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse control, for holding a behavioral plan across time, for executing the instruction, "Don't react," is the specific target of that degradation. It doesn't go offline completely. It just becomes unreliable at exactly the moment you're demanding the most from it. You walk in with a plan and a stressed brain, and the plan is the first casualty. This is the core problem with willpower as a composure strategy. It asks the brake to engage after the skid has already started, using the exact neural hardware that stress has partially removed from service. That isn't a discipline failure. It's a sequencing error. You are trying to apply the solution at the wrong point in the chain. The wall is not built in the room. It is built in the weeks before you ever walk into it. What that means specifically is this. Composure under pressure is not an in-the-moment performance. It is the output of a nervous system whose baseline has been structurally altered through repeated physiological training. The difference between the person who holds through the extinction burst and the person who breaks isn't what they're telling themselves in that moment. It's what their amygdala is doing, what their vagal tone is doing, what their interoceptive precision is doing, all of which were set before the conversation began, through work that happened somewhere quiet and unglamorous, without an audience. Sarah Lazar, at Harvard Medical School, published findings in Neuro Report in 2005, showing that 8 weeks of consistent mindfulness practice produced measurable cortical thickening in the insula and the prefrontal cortex. Not a shift in attitude, not improved coping. Physical structural change, visible on a brain scan. The hardware got better. Britta Holzell and colleagues at Massachusetts General Hospital, publishing in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience in 2010, found that the drop in perceived stress after the 8-week protocol correlated with reduced gray matter density in the amygdala. The alarm didn't just feel quieter, it became structurally quieter. Quote, 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 quote. The firing threshold rose. The signal that used to require a significant suppression effort now required less, because the source was generating less. 8 weeks. Not years, and not a wholesale rebuild of your personality. 8 weeks of consistent, specific practice produced changes you could see on imaging. That is the target, not the room, the weeks before it. What follows is exactly what that training looks like, checkpoint by checkpoint. In the same order, the leaks were introduced because the stack has to be built in a specific sequence, and the sequence is not arbitrary. The detection gap is the only territory in this entire system where you have direct influence over what exits the body. Everything downstream of it, the breath rate, the face, the voice, those are outputs. The gap is the moment before the output commits. Between the amygdala firing and the expression reaching the surface, there is a window, narrow by default, trainable with specific work. You cannot widen it by trying to widen it in the moment. That is the willpower error applied to a different layer. The gap gets wider through a practice that has nothing to do with high-stakes rooms, because the practice only works when the body is quiet enough that its early signals are audible. The drill is a body scan, and not the soft, diffuse version you've probably encountered somewhere on an app. This version is specific and has a target. Sit down in a chair. No input, no task. Start at the jaw. Not what you're thinking about your jaw, what it is physically doing right now. Is there tension along the back teeth? A slight hold in the masseter. Move to the chest. Not the broad emotional register of tense or relaxed. The specific, localized sensation of where the chest is carrying load right now, this moment. The hands, the gut, the base of the throat. What you're mapping is not how you feel. You're mapping the physical precursors to how you'll feel, and the distinction matters completely. By the time an emotional state is recognizable as an emotion, it has already aggregated from dozens of smaller physical signals that began several seconds earlier. Most people never catch those signals because they only start listening once the emotion is already loud enough to name. The drill trains you to hear it before it has a name, when it's still just tension in a specific set of muscles, or a change in how the chest is holding, or a subtle shift in gut pressure that hasn't yet been interpreted as anything. The progression is weekly. In the first week, the goal is simply to notice any physical signal you didn't register before the scan. That's it. One thing you weren't tracking, now tracked. In the second week, you're trying to move the registration earlier to catch the same signal at a slightly lower intensity than you caught it the week before. The aim across 8 weeks is to pull the detection point back, incrementally, until you're registering stress precursors at the level of micro-change rather than at the level of expression. Hugo Critchley's research at University College London, which we covered at Checkpoint 5, established that interoceptive accuracy predicts the precision and speed of emotional regulation. The finding has a direct application here. The earlier you intercept the signal, the more routing options you have. At expression level, you have one option, suppress, which, as we know, makes the leak worse. At micro-expression level, you have 2 or 3. At the physical precursor level, before the signal has aggregated into anything the face can carry, you have the full range, because nothing has committed yet. The gap doesn't widen because you're trying harder to control yourself. It widens because you're reading the signal earlier and earlier, until the point of interception moves upstream of the exit entirely. The expression never forms because you routed the input before it had enough momentum to become one, daily, 10 minutes. No high-stakes environment required. The practice runs in quiet, and the benefit arrives in noise. This is the foundational layer, because everything built on top of it depends on your ability to catch the signal before it has already left. HRV training is next, and it works on the break directly. A trained marksman doesn't fight his own heartbeat. He waits for the pause after the exhale, when the body goes still between beats, and releases the shot into that gap, because a single beat at the wrong instant moves the barrel a hair, and the round is gone. That gap is vagal tone. You met it at Checkpoint 3. Here is how you build it. The break is a muscle. The vagal system that governs your ability to recover from a stress spike, to keep your voice steady when the pressure climbs, to hold the detection gap open long enough to route the signal, responds to load the same way skeletal muscle responds to resistance. Apply the right load consistently, and it gets stronger. Leave it untrained, and it stays where it is. Adequate for ordinary days, insufficient for the moments that matter. Heart rate variability is the live readout of that break. And unlike most of the system, you can load it on purpose. You met the measure itself at Checkpoint 3, the constant fluctuation in the gap between beats, wide when the break is engaged and responsive, flat and rigid when the system is running without slack, without the flexibility to absorb a threat and return to baseline before it exits through the face or the voice. Julian Thayer and Richard Lane, publishing in the Journal of Affective Disorders in 2000, reviewed the research linking HRV to behavioral outcomes and found that people with higher HRV showed faster recovery from emotional disruption, better inhibitory control under pressure, and more flexible responses when situations demanded a shift in approach. The break being stronger didn't just mean they felt calmer. It meant their outputs, voice, expression, timing, posture, were measurably less reactive to the same inputs that destabilized lower HRV individuals. The signal the room received from them was different, not because they were performing composure, but because the underlying system was producing less noise. HRV is not fixed. This is the part that makes it worth training, rather than simply measuring. The break responds to a specific kind of load, and the load has a name: resonance, frequency, breathing. The mechanics are straightforward. You breathe at approximately 5 to 6 full breath cycles per minute, slower than normal, but not dramatically so. At this pace, the inhale and exhale fall into direct rhythmic alignment with the heart's natural oscillation frequency, creating a condition called cardiovascular resonance. The vagus nerve, which is the primary wire between the brainstem and the heart, receives a consistent, rhythmic stimulus at exactly the rate it responds to most efficiently. The HRV amplitude increases. The brake is being loaded. This is not a relaxation exercise. The confusion between the two is common and expensive. Relaxation is a state. This is a drill, the difference between a hot bath and a training session that produces lasting physical adaptation. The heart and the vagal system are being worked, not soothed. Paul Lehrer and Richard Gevertz, reviewing the science in Frontiers in Psychology in 2014, documented how resonance frequency HRV biofeedback breathing at roughly 6 breaths a minute strengthens the baroreflex and raises HRV amplitude with consistent practice. The break gets objectively stronger under targeted load. The protocol is 5 minutes per day, at a time when you're not under stress. Morning works. Before a meal works. The specific timing matters less than the consistency and the absence of acute stress during the drill, because you're training the brake's resting capacity, not its performance under fire. You lift before the game so the muscle is stronger when you need it. You don't lift during the game and expect the same adaptation. One more thing about HRV that the research makes clear. The gains are cumulative, and they don't reset. A stressful event draws on the reserve the training is built, but it doesn't erase it. Recovery after the event gets faster as the baseline rises. The system gets more elastic, not just stronger, which means it returns to a regulated state more quickly after a provocation, and the window where the leak is most likely to exit gets narrower with every week of consistent work. The break gets stronger. The next layer works on the face directly, or rather, on the source upstream of it. The instinct is to try to hold the face still. You feel the signal arriving. You know the expression is coming, and you clench down on it. You flatten the muscles. You lock the jaw. You produce what you believe is a neutral face. What you've actually produced is a face under visible strain, and the strain is louder than the expression would have been. James Gross and Robert Levinson, at the University of California, Berkeley, published research in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 1993 that measured exactly what suppression costs. When participants were instructed to hide their emotional reactions to aversive footage, their sympathetic nervous system activation increased relative to participants who were allowed to express normally. The body wasn't fooled by the held face. It registered the suppression as an additional load on top of the original stressor, which meant the physiological signal that drives involuntary expression got louder, not quieter. The harder they held the face, the more the body pushed back against the hold. Suppression is a tug-of-war between the voluntary face and the upstream signal driving the involuntary one, and the upstream signal has more raw power than the voluntary system does. William Rinn's work, which we covered at Checkpoint 4, established that these two pathways run on separate neural hardware. You can clench down on one wire all you want. The other wire keeps carrying current, so the face isn't the target. The upstream signal is. If the amygdala fires at lower intensity, the involuntary pathway receives a weaker input. A weaker input produces a smaller involuntary expression, one that falls below the threshold of detection, one that the voluntary face doesn't have to fight against because there's barely anything to fight. The face is consistent not because you held it that way, but because the source sending its signal had less to send. James Gross, this time publishing from Stanford in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 1998, tested cognitive reappraisal directly against suppression as a regulatory strategy. Participants who reappraised the meaning of a stressor before encountering it showed reduced amygdala response to the stressor itself and produced less involuntary facial expression than those who tried to suppress after the fact. The physiological cost was also lower heart rate, skin conductance. The whole autonomic profile was less activated in the reappraisal group. They didn't hold the face. They reduced what the face had to carry. The practical application is cold and specific. Before you walk into a high-stakes interaction, you install a frame, not an affirmation, not a motivational sentence, a tactical description of what is mechanically happening. They are running a predictive model. They built that model from your previous outputs. This interaction is a data problem. What they do next depends on what data you provide. Your physiological response to their move is an input variable in their model, and you are about to control that variable. That framing is not meant to make you feel better about the interaction. It's meant to alter how the amygdala classifies it. The amygdala's threat assessment runs on context, on the framing that was active at the moment the stimulus arrived. A frame that categorizes the interaction as a data problem rather than a personal threat produces a different initial assessment, which produces a different firing intensity, which produces a smaller involuntary expression, which produces a face you don't have to suppress, because it doesn't need suppressing. The reappraisal doesn't have to feel true. It has to be installed before the room. Once you're inside the interaction and the signal has already fired, reappraisal is too slow. The window is before the door opens. That's when the frame goes in. That's when the amygdala receives its instructions about what it's about to encounter. Get in early, and the face handles itself. Every other layer in this stack operates on a system you cannot access directly. The amygdala fires on its own schedule. The vagal tone reflects weeks of accumulated conditioning. The involuntary face runs on a circuit you don't control. But the breath sits at the intersection of the voluntary and the autonomic, and that position makes it unlike anything else in the body. You can take it over at any moment. No tool, no preparation, no specific environment required. The hand that reaches for the light switch can also reach the vagus nerve, and it does it through the exhale. The training most people attempt is breathing during stress. They feel the signal arrive. They remember the technique. They try to slow down. This fails not because the technique is wrong, but because the timing is. By the time you're consciously invoking a breathing method, the autonomic cascade is already running, and the breath is already entrained to it. You're not steering, you're dragging. The breath under stress defaults to whatever pattern it was already conditioned to run, and if that pattern is shallow and chest-driven, no amount of in-the-moment intention overrides years of default wiring. The training target is the default, not what happens when you try, what happens when you don't. The drill is structurally simple and physiologically precise. Inhale for a count of 4, exhale for a count of 8. The ratio is the mechanism. An extended exhale activates the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system through direct vagal stimulation. This is the well-established physiology of vagal heart control we covered at checkpoint 2. The exhale raises vagal tone through respiratory sinus arrhythmia. The exhale engages the brake. The longer the exhale relative to the inhale, the stronger the engagement. A body sustaining a long controlled exhale cannot simultaneously maintain peak sympathetic activation. The two states are physiologically incompatible, not difficult to hold simultaneously. Incompatible, 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 incompatible. What this drill produces over weeks of daily practice is a resting breath pattern that is shifted toward the lower, slower end of the rate range without requiring you to think about it. The diaphragm becomes the default engine rather than the chest. The exhale to inhale ratio lengthens without instruction. And when stress arrives and the sympathetic system pushes for a faster, higher pattern, it's working against a conditioned default that actively resists the shift, not because you're consciously resisting, but because the wiring has changed. The practical result in a high-stakes room is this: the breath doesn't climb. Not because you're managing it, but because its resting state is already low enough that the stress response has less distance to move it before it becomes visible. The chest stays down. The rate stays close to baseline. The signal that a cross-examining lawyer watches for breath, moving from belly into chest, confirming the next answer will be defensive, doesn't appear. because the default pattern was built to stay low before you ever walked in. The drill runs once a day, 5 to 10 minutes, in a condition of baseline calm, morning, before the day has applied its load. Not as a ritual, not as a meditation, as a conditioning session for a specific physiological output. The body learns what you repeat. Repeat slow exhales in calm conditions, and the body brings that pattern with it into the conditions that aren't calm. Everything above the breath on this stack depends on the breath staying where you put it. This is the infrastructure. Build it before the rest of the wall means anything. The voice goes first. Before the face commits to anything, before the posture shifts, before a single word carries, meaning the acoustic properties of how you're speaking have already told the room what it needs to know. Pitch climbs under stress. Rate accelerates. The natural variation in tone that makes a voice sound grounded and present flattens out into something clipped and effortful. These aren't subtle shifts, detectable only by instruments. Klaus Scherer, at the University of Geneva, publishing in Psychological Bulletin in 1986, demonstrated that trained listeners could identify emotional state from voice recordings alone at rates well above chance, and the identification happened before conscious analysis, in the same automatic, below-awareness register that reads facial micro-expressions. The room hears the stress before anyone decides they heard it. What makes the voice particularly expensive as a leak is its social primacy. Research in communication consistently shows that acoustic properties of speech are processed before semantic content. The brain reads how something is said before it processes what is being said, which means that by the time your carefully considered words arrive, the room has already filed its preliminary verdict based on pitch, rate, and prosody. A measured sentence delivered in a voice running 3% faster than baseline and 4% higher in pitch reads as defensive, regardless of its content. The words are arguing against an acoustic signal that got there first. The common response to this information is to try to speak slowly. That is the wrong intervention. For the same structural reason suppression fails on the face. Deliberately slowing your speech under pressure is an effortful act, and effort changes the acoustic profile in its own detectable ways. A strained evenness, an unnaturally controlled pace that reads as performed rather than regulated. The room notices the effort, even if it can't name what it's hearing. You've replaced one tell with another. The actual training target is the gap between your baseline voice and your voice under pressure. The goal is not a slower voice. It's no audible difference between the two states. The voice you use when the conversation is easy, and the voice you use when the offer comes in low, or the comment lands in front of an audience. Those two voices should be acoustically indistinguishable. That gap, when it exists, is the confirmation their model needs. The drill runs before high-stakes interactions, not during them. Record yourself speaking on a neutral topic for 2 minutes, something with no emotional weight. Then introduce a stressor, a prepared provocation, a difficult scenario you read aloud to yourself, an uncomfortable question you answer on record. Play both recordings back. The comparison is the diagnostic. Where does pitch move? Where does rate accelerate? Where does the prosody go flat? Those specific parameters are what you target in the next round of practice. Professional negotiators train this explicitly. So do surgeons who communicate with teams during procedures and pilots during abnormal checklists. Any domain where a voice broadcasting urgency changes the behavior of the people around it in ways that make the situation worse. The voice under pressure is not a personality trait. It is an output that responds to practice, and the practice is specific. Find the gap. Record the gap. Close the gap across repeated exposure until the baseline and the pressure state have merged into one acoustic profile. Give the room nothing to hear. The silence checkpoint is built on the same principle, and it's the hardest one to train, for reasons that have nothing to do with the voice. Watch someone in an elevator the second it goes quiet between floors. 4 seconds of nothing, and the hand moves to the phone, not to check anything, just to escape the vacuum. That reflex is what you're about to train out of yourself. Nobody has trained it. That's not an assumption. It is the baseline condition Timothy Wilson's research exposed. The untrained nervous system finds unstructured silence so aversive, it will choose physical pain to escape it. That is where almost everyone starts. Not at some moderate discomfort with quiet, at the level of self-administered electric shocks. The gap between that baseline and the 4 seconds of held silence that dismantled the negotiation at the start of this section is not a personality difference. It is a training difference. And unlike HRV conditioning or interoceptive drilling, this one has no equipment, no technique, no physiological mechanism to learn. It has one instruction: sit down, set a timer, and do nothing. That simplicity is why most people dismiss it, and why most people never close the gap. Start with 2 minutes. No phone within reach, no audio, no task running in the background. Sit in a chair and let the silence be there. What happens in the first 30 seconds of this, if you've never done it deliberately, is informative, in a way nothing else on this list is. The body generates noise to fill the vacuum, a thought that demands follow-up, a physical restlessness, an urge to check something, resolve something, produce something. None of that is distraction in the ordinary sense. It is the prediction machine doing exactly what Friston described, running an error signal against an environment that isn't providing expected input and generating behavior to correct the error. The behavior is the urge to reach for something. The training is watching the urge without following it. The goal in those 2 minutes is not stillness in the physical sense, and it's not calm in the emotional sense. The goal is to let the aversive signal run without routing it outward, not to suppress it. Suppression, as we've covered, costs more than it saves. To sit inside it and allow it to exist without producing the behavior it's requesting, that distinction matters, because it's the same distinction that separates held composure from performed composure. You're not trying to feel nothing. You're training the gap between feeling something and doing something about it. Add 1 minute per week. By the end of 6 weeks, you're sitting in 8 minutes of deliberate silence per day. That number isn't arbitrary. It maps roughly to the duration range. Wilson's participants found unbearable, which means you're training at the upper edge of the aversive range, where the adaptation is most durable. You're not building comfort with mildly quiet conditions. You're building the capacity to hold a state the untrained nervous system treats as an emergency. The silence drill does something the other training layers don't. It directly conditions your response to the social vacuum that silence creates when it's deployed in conversation. When you've spent weeks sitting inside the aversive signal without routing it outward, the 4-second gap after an offer lands, the one that forces the other side to revise, stops feeling like a dangerous void you need to fill. It feels like familiar terrain. You've been here. The signal is the same one you've been practicing not answering. The only difference is that this time, someone else is generating it too, and they haven't trained. The asymmetry that silence creates your regulation against their escalating error signal runs entirely on that difference in conditioning. They need you to fill the space because their system has never learned to sit in the empty one. You don't need to fill it because you've been sitting in empty rooms for weeks, watching the urge arrive and choosing not to follow it. The silence is a weapon built in quiet. You build it alone, in ordinary conditions, without an audience. When the moment comes, it's already there. Picture the moment before the hardest conversation you've had this year, not during it before. The heart is running fast. The hands are cooler than they should be. The chest is doing something you don't have words for, somewhere between tight and hollow. And somewhere underneath all of it is the thought you've carried your whole life about what those sensations mean, that they're evidence against you, that a person who was ready, who was strong enough, who had this handled, wouldn't feel this way, that the body is announcing, in its own biological language, that you're about to lose. That red is wrong, and the wrongness of it isn't philosophical, it's mechanical, and it has a name. Alia Crum, then at Yale, publishing in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2013, ran a series of studies examining what actually predicts performance outcomes under physiological stress. The stress response itself, the elevated heart rate, the cortisol, the accelerated breath, the whole cascade did not predict impaired performance. What predicted impaired performance was the belief that the stress response predicted impaired performance. The body's reaction to high stakes wasn't the problem. The interpretation of that reaction was. Participants who were shown that stress responses enhance performance under pressure performed better on the same tasks, with the same physiological activation, than participants who were given the standard framing. Same body, different sentence, different outcome. Jeremy Jameson and Wendy Mendez pushed this further. In research published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, General in 2012, they had participants reappraise their pre-task arousal, not suppress it, not calm it, not breathe it down, but actively reframe it as the body preparing, rather than failing. The group that reappraised showed not just better performance scores, but measurably different cardiovascular profiles during the task. Blood vessels stayed more open, cardiac output was higher. The body wasn't running a threat response, it was running a challenge response. Same hormones, same activation level, different downstream physiology, because the interpretation upstream had changed. The distinction between a threat response and a challenge response isn't semantic. It's the difference between a system allocating resources toward defense and a system allocating them toward performance. Both produce elevated heart rate. Both produce faster breathing. One of them also produces vascular constriction, which reduces blood flow to the brain and makes fine motor and cognitive outputs worse. The other doesn't. The body generates one or the other based largely on how the situation has been framed before the response begins, which is exactly why the reappraisal has to be installed before the room, not attempted mid-conversation when the frame is already running. Now connect this to the predictive model framework. When you walk into an interaction where someone has been getting a reaction out of you, and you feel that chest tightening, heart rate climbing sensation, here is what is mechanically true. Their model is live. They've run the cue. The prediction is active. Your nervous system is responding to the stakes of what's about to happen, which means your body already understands that something real is in play. The surge is not a malfunction. It's the body confirming that this matters and allocating accordingly. The only question is where those resources go. If they go into expression, into the face, the voice, the posture, they feed the model. They become the data the dopamine circuit was waiting for. The confirmation arrives, the reward registers, and the move gets filed as reliable. If they go into the hold, into the detection gap, the breath staying low, the voice staying flat, the silence sitting undisturbed, they starve the model. The resources the body sent for the fight are being used to deny the fight's existence. The arousal becomes fuel for the wall, not a crack in it. The cold reframe is this: the surge means the bet is live. And a live bet that gets no confirmation is a bet that breaks. The feeling you've been treating as a warning is the announcement that you're about to win, if you route it correctly. That routing is what the 6 training layers build. The wall isn't calm. It's a fully loaded system running everything inward. 6 months of confirmations. 6 months of the same move, producing the same output, the model running clean every time, the dopamine circuit filing the cue as reliable. And then you walk into the room. Nothing about the entrance signals anything. That's the first thing the other person notices without knowing they noticed it. There's no visible steadying, no deliberate arrangement of the expression, no moment where you appear to be preparing yourself. You're simply present in the space, moving at the same pace you moved yesterday in a hallway where nothing was at stake. The body doesn't announce what's about to happen because the body doesn't know it as a threat. The reappraisal was installed before you opened the door. The classification was already running. The move arrives, the comment, the offer, the pointed question, whatever form it takes in this particular room. And something happens inside you that anyone who has never trained this would describe as a kind of gap. The amygdala fires. The signal moves. And then it finds a detection window that is wider than it was 6 months ago, wider than it was 6 weeks ago. And the expression that should have followed the signal doesn't arrive on schedule. There's a pause where the reaction used to be. Not a frozen pause, not a performance of stillness, just the absence of the output their model was waiting for. The breath doesn't move. The chest stays exactly where it was when you walked in. Rate unchanged. Location unchanged. The signal that a trained observer watches for breath pulling upward out of the belly, the body physically climbing toward a defensive register, isn't there. Not because you're managing it, because its conditioned default is already low enough that the stress response didn't have room to move it visibly. When you speak, it's at the same pitch you used 2 minutes ago, when the conversation was still easy. Same rate. The prosody hasn't flattened into the clipped, effortful evenness that signals a person holding something back. The room hears baseline, because the acoustic gap between your baseline and your pressure state has been closed through weeks of recorded practice and deliberate exposure. The words carry only what you put in them. Nothing extra arrives ahead of them. The face is coherent, not rigid, not a mask someone applied, and is now maintaining with visible effort. Coherent meaning the voluntary expression and the involuntary one are aligned, because the upstream signal driving the involuntary pathway is running at reduced intensity. Less input, less output. There's nothing to suppress because there isn't enough upstream pressure to break through the threshold where suppression becomes necessary. And then the silence. After the move lands, you don't fill the space. The offer, the comment, the provocation sits in the room untouched. 1 second. 2. The other person's nervous system is already running the error signal. The expected output hasn't arrived. The model is requesting confirmation. The confirmation isn't coming. 3 seconds. 4. The wall is up, and it doesn't look like a wall. It looks like someone who has nowhere they need to be, and nothing they need to say. From across the table, it reads as indifference, and that read is wrong. It is a fully loaded system, running every training layer simultaneously, routing everything inward. The arousal is there. The signal is there. The resources the body allocated for this moment are all present and engaged. They're just not going where they used to go. Their model has nothing to confirm, and a model that can't confirm starts to question itself. On their side of the table, something has gone wrong, and they don't have language for it yet. The cue ran. The move that has worked reliably for months, the comment, the offer, the reframing of your position as emotional, arrived exactly as it always has, and the output didn't come. The nervous system expected a specific signal and received nothing. Not a different signal, not a countering signal, nothing. And the nothing is not neutral. It is, as Wolfram Schultz's dopamine research established, an active error state, a below baseline signal that the brain's prediction circuit generates when a confirmed reward fails to materialize. They're not simply waiting. They're in mild neurological distress, and they have no idea that's what's happening. The first response is almost always an escalation. They repeat the move. Not a different move, the same one, slightly louder, slightly more pointed. This is not a strategic decision. It is the prediction machine doing the only thing it knows how to do when a model fails. Run the input again at higher intensity and see if the output comes through this time. The person across the table from you is not choosing to push harder. Their system is pushing for them, the same way a hand presses harder on a door that didn't open the first time. The behavior isn't a sign that they're more committed to breaking you. It's a sign that their model has started to panic. If the wall holds through the escalation, the second phase arrives, confusion. And confusion, in this context, has a specific texture that's worth knowing how to read. They pause. Not a thinking pause, a recalibration pause. The kind that happens when a system that was running on confident prediction suddenly has no prediction to run. They look for a new angle. Maybe they shift the framing. Maybe they try a different register humor where there was pressure where there was ease. Maybe the voice changes in a way they're not tracking. What you're watching is a person rummaging through their model for an input combination that produces the output they need, finding nothing that fits, and starting to understand on some pre-verbal level that the model itself might be the problem. This confusion is the most important window in the entire interaction. Most people mistake it for an opening to explain themselves, to offer something, to ease the tension, and the mistake is expensive, because any data you provide at this moment gets absorbed into the reconstruction of their model. You're handing them building materials for a new version of the thing that was just breaking. The confusion is not a gap to fill. It is the productive state you've been building toward. Let it sit. If the wall holds through the recalibration, the third phase is withdrawal. The behavior stops generating. Not because they've decided to try something different, because the nervous system has assessed the cost-to-output ratio of continuing and stopped allocating resources toward a behavior that has produced nothing. The energy that used to organize itself around you, that slightly elevated, slightly targeted quality of attention, disengages. They're still in the room, but they've left the position they were holding. What they feel in that withdrawal is not anger. Anger still has an object, still has a target, still generates behavior toward resolution. What they feel is closer to the specific discomfort of social helplessness, of being in an environment where their usual instruments don't produce readings. You're not someone they've lost to. You're someone they can't run. And an environment where the instruments don't work is one the nervous system learns, through prediction error, to approach with reduced confidence. The status this produces doesn't require an announcement. It's already in the room, written in how they're moving now compared to how they moved before the wall went up. The break doesn't happen at round 1. It doesn't happen at round 2. It happens at round 4, when the escalation arrives harder than anything that came before it, and the part of your brain that has been tracking the effort of holding sends up a signal that sounds exactly like reason. This isn't working. That signal is a lie, and it's the most expensive lie in this entire system. Here is what's actually happening at round 4. The prediction error has been compounding across every failed confirmation. The dopamine circuit ran the cue 3 times and got nothing back, and each miss generated a stronger error signal than the one before it, the brain's equivalent of pressing harder, faster, with more urgency, because the model it's running has started to feel unstable, and the system responds to model instability by increasing output. The escalation at round 4 is not evidence of strength. It is a system in distress spending its last reserves. You don't know that in the moment. What you feel in the moment is that the pressure has increased, that the move has arrived with an edge it didn't have before, that the room has shifted in some way that seems to confirm your hold is failing. And so you answer. You offer a correction, or a defense, or you let something show in the face that gives them what they came for. In that single moment, here is what you've actually transmitted. 3 rounds of silence, plus 1 escalation, equals a reaction. That's the new model. They didn't just get the reaction. They got the formula for the reaction. The wall you spent weeks building just handed them its own blueprint. Lerman and Iwata's research in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in 1995 documented the extinction burst specifically as the most common source of unintentional reinforcement in behavioral conditioning. The pattern is consistent. A person holds through the early rounds. The burst arrives. They respond to the burst, and the conditioned behavior becomes more durable than it was before the hold began. The burst that should have ended the pattern instead taught the system that the pattern works, it just requires more intensity. The new threshold is higher. You've made your own situation harder. The only way to survive the breakpoint is to know it's coming before it arrives. Not as a general concept. As a specific expectation, the 4th provocation will be harder than the first 3. And that hardness is not a sign the strategy is failing. It is a sign the model is failing. Those are opposite things. The burst intensity is a countdown, not a score. The harder they push at round 4, the fewer rounds remain before the behavior stops generating. But you have to be inside that understanding before the room, because once the escalation lands and the error signal is running, the rational framing that would let you hold is running on the same prefrontal hardware that stress has compromised. There is one rule for the burst, and it has no qualifications. You do not respond to it. Not with explanation, not with a visible reaction, not with anything the model can use to recalibrate. The silence that held through rounds 1, 2, and 3 holds through round 4, at exactly the same depth, with no visible acknowledgement that round 4 was different from the others. Because from your side of the wall, it wasn't. The signal arrived, the detection gap held, the outputs stayed at baseline. The escalation got the same wall every other move got. One more round of stillness after the burst and the model collapses. That's all it takes. One more round. The collapse doesn't announce itself. There's no confrontation, no acknowledgement, no moment where they look across the room and concede. What happens is quieter than that. And if you're expecting something dramatic, you'll miss it entirely. The first sign is a change in approach velocity. The person who used to walk toward you with a certain quality of directed energy, not necessarily hostile, just targeted, carrying the low-level forward lean of someone who expects to get something from the interaction, starts arriving differently. The targeting drops out. They're still in the same room, still occupying the same role, but the approach has lost the thing that made it feel like an approach. They're moving toward you, the way they move toward furniture. Neutral, uninvested. The casual provocations stop first. These are the lowest cost moves in anyone's repertoire, the offhand comment, the small reframing, the light jab designed to take a reading without committing to a full play. When those stop, it's not because they've decided to be more professional or take a higher road. It's because the nervous system has stopped generating the impulse. The cue that used to automatically trigger the behavior is running against a stored outcome of nothing. And a behavior that consistently produces nothing doesn't get funded. The impulse doesn't fire as strongly, then less strongly, then not at all. They're not suppressing the move. They've stopped reaching for it. What replaces the casual provocations is sometimes nothing, a straightforward flatness where the dynamic used to be, and sometimes something stranger, a new formality, a slightly increased care in how they phrase things around you, a tendency to double-check what they've said before they've finished saying it. This isn't respect in the way the word usually gets used. It's the behavioral signature of a nervous system that has flagged an environment as one where its standard instruments produce unreliable readings. Close quote. They're not choosing to be careful. They're being careful the way you're careful near something you don't fully understand. In group settings, the shift becomes visible to people who weren't part of the original dynamic. They don't have access to the history, they just have the current data, which is that the person who used to carry a certain posture around you no longer carries it. The recalibration happened between the two of you, but the room reads it as a status signal, because that's what it is. The withdrawal, the new formality, the reduced approach, energy, those are all legible. Other people update their models of you based on what they're reading and how someone else treats you. The shift compounds without requiring any additional action from you. The durability of this is worth being specific about. They're not taking a break from the move and waiting for an opening. The original model is gone, not suspended. Gone. The prediction circuit that funded the behavior ran a confirmed sequence of errors and closed the line. To run a new model on you, they'd need new data, a fresh set of outputs from you that they could pattern match against. And you're not providing that, which means the model that replaced the broken one is no usable data. Approach with reduced confidence. The nervous system's version of that is behavioral distance, and behavioral distance is self-sustaining. The less they approach, the less data they collect, the less the new model develops, the more the distance persists. You didn't win an argument. You didn't outmaneuver them in any way they could point to. What you did was make yourself something the nervous system cannot safely run its standard operations against, and that classification, once it's been written by prediction error, is not something they can choose to revise. The room keeps the score. They just live with it. Most people expect this to feel like something, like a shift in the room's gravity, or a quiet vindication, or at minimum the satisfaction of a problem solved. They've been carrying the weight of a dynamic that was costing them something every time it ran: attention, resources, the low-grade expenditure of being perpetually prepared for the next move, and they assumed that when the weight lifted, they'd feel the lifting. It doesn't work that way. What you feel is an absence, not the presence of something better. Just the absence of a noise that had been running so long you'd stopped registering it as noise. The provocation isn't there anymore, which means the low-level preparation for it isn't there anymore, which means a background process that has been consuming resources since before you could name it has stopped running. You don't feel the relief of that directly. What you feel is a slightly unfamiliar sense of having more room than you had yesterday, and it takes a beat to understand what you're actually noticing. This is worth naming precisely, because the expectation of victory is one of the things that can undo the state you've built. If you're waiting for the collapse to feel like winning, you're still running a model that needs something from the interaction. You're still oriented toward their behavior as the input that determines your output. That orientation is the same one that made you readable in the first place. The collapse doesn't hand you a feeling. It removes a cost. The space it creates has a specific quality: presence. Not dominance, not the elevated status that other people in the room are now reading, just the experience of being in a conversation without a portion of your processing dedicated to managing what's coming next. from one particular direction. The person who used to require a defensive allocation is now just another person in the room, and the resources that went to tracking them are available for other things. You think more clearly in their presence than you used to. You notice more. The interaction produces information instead of consuming it. This is what the composure framework actually delivers at its terminus. Not the feeling of being powerful, but the end of the drain. The dynamic that was running you has stopped running. The model that kept generating moves against you has gone dark, and the result is not triumph. It's the ordinary experience of running your own life, without a portion of it leased to someone else's prediction machine. The person who no longer has a working model of you cannot prepare for you. They cannot position against you. They cannot run the soft calculations that used to happen before every interaction. What angle to take, what input reliably produces, which output, how much pressure before the signal arrives. You are, in the operational sense, outside their system. And outside someone's system is the only position from which you cannot be moved. You didn't take something from them. You stopped giving them something. The distinction is the whole point. There's a second use for everything you've built, and most people never get to it because they spend the entire interaction managing their own system. Once the wall is up and running without conscious maintenance, once the detection gap is wide enough, the breath conditioned enough, the silence tolerance trained enough that the stack operates below the level of active attention, something opens up on the other side of the table. You're no longer fully occupied with your own outputs, which means you can read theirs. The 7 checkpoints are a framework in both directions. Start with the detection gap. When a question lands or a piece of information arrives that changes the stakes, watch for the moment before the response. Not the response itself, the gap before it. A person with a narrow detection gap leaks in that gap. The expression that exits before the controlled one arrives. The micro-adjustment in posture that happens before they've decided how to hold themselves. The breath that catches before they've chosen what to say. That gap tells you what the information did to them internally, before any strategic presentation has had time to organize. A gap that's clean, no visible response before the controlled one tells you either they're regulated or they were already positioned for that information. Both readings are useful. The gap that isn't clean tells you what the information cost them. And that's the number you're working with. The breath is the easiest channel to track once you're no longer occupied with your own. Watch where it lives in the body, belly, or chest. Watch what happens to it when pressure increases, when the conversation moves toward a topic they'd rather not land on, when an offer comes in below their position, when a question arrives that they weren't ready for. The breath moving from diaphragm into chest is not ambiguous. It's the autonomic system shifting register, and it happens before the person can decide whether to let you see it. You're not looking for the dramatic chest heave of visible distress. You're looking for the small upward migration that happens in the first second after a stressor lands. The voice tells you what the breath confirms. Rate, pitch, the slight flattening of prosody when someone is managing something. Klaus Scherer's acoustic research established these as reliable signals, and they don't require specialist training to detect. You've been hearing stressed voices your whole life. What changes when you know what you're listening for is that you stop processing the content and start processing the acoustic signal underneath it. The words tell you their position. The voice tells you their state. The face is the most information-dense channel and the hardest to read quickly. But the principle is simple. You're looking for coherence. When voluntary expression and involuntary expression align, when what the face is presenting matches what the body is running, the read is clean and probably accurate. When they don't align, the gap between them is the signal. The controlled smile that doesn't reach the muscles around the eyes. The neutral expression that arrives just a moment too late, after something that should have produced a reaction. Those gaps are where the real data lives, and they exist because the voluntary and involuntary pathways, as Rin's work established, run on separate hardware that can, and does, contradict itself. Then watch for their silence tolerance. Introduce a pause after something lands, not a gap you fill, a space you hold deliberately, and observe what happens on their side. How long before something moves? How long before they speak, shift, offer something unsolicited? The person who breaks a 4-second silence at second 2 is telling you something about their current regulation state that no amount of careful positioning can override. Their system found the vacuum intolerable, faster than they could manage the signal. What you're building across all 7 channels is a real-time picture of their internal state, not their stated position, their actual physiological condition. People negotiate from their stated position. They break from their actual one. The distance between those two is where your leverage lives. You're not manipulating them. You're operating on accurate information while they operate on what they can present. That asymmetry is the whole game. You already know the move before you walk in. They've used it before, not on you specifically, but on everyone who has sat across from them in this room. And the people who brief you afterward always describe it the same way. They open low. Not accidentally low. Not a reasonable anchor that leaves room to negotiate. Insultingly low. The kind of number that's designed to produce a visible reaction, because the reaction is the first piece of data they need. They watch for the flinch, the sharp breath, the color that moves into the face, and once they have it, the number becomes secondary. They've already gotten what they came for. They know where your floor is, not because you told them, but because your body did. You sit down. The room is the kind that's designed to communicate their position before anyone speaks. The table slightly too wide, the chairs slightly lower on your side than theirs. The overhead light positioned to land on your face and not theirs. None of this is accidental, and none of it matters. The environment is trying to prime a threat response in you before the conversation begins, and you've spent the last several weeks doing something more targeted than preparing talking points. You've been conditioning the system that generates the response the environment is trying to trigger. The reappraisal was running before you opened the door. The classification was already in place. This room is a data problem, not a threat. They open with pleasantries, and you match them at the same pitch and rate you'd use to order coffee. Not performed ease. Baseline. The prosody is even, because there's nothing straining it. The conversation moves through setup terms, timeline, general parameters, and your voice stays where it started. Same tempo, same register. They're collecting acoustic data and getting nothing they can use. Then the number arrives. They frame it as an opening position, which is technically true, and functionally a provocation. The figure is 40% below what the preparation established as market. They deliver it with the particular stillness of someone who has watched that number land on other people before and knows what it usually produces. A pause, a redirect, an explanation of why it's not realistic. Some version of engagement with the insult. The engagement is the tell. Any engagement confirms the number hit something. Inside you, something fires. The drop that happens in the stomach before the brain has fully processed the words, that's Ledoux's fast pathway running exactly as designed. The amygdala registering threat before conscious analysis is available. The signal moves, and then it finds a detection window that has been trained wide enough to catch it before the expression assembles. There is a gap. Not a visible gap from their side. No performance of stillness. No moment where you appear to be holding something back. Just the ordinary space of a person who hasn't yet decided whether to respond. The breath doesn't move. It was already low when they made the offer, and the offer didn't change where it lives. The chest stays down. The rate holds. The signal that a practiced observer reads as confirmation breath, pulling up and forward, body climbing into defensive register, isn't there for them to read. The face gives them nothing. Not because you're managing it, but because the upstream signal that would have driven the involuntary expression is running at reduced intensity. The reappraisal installed before the room changed what the detection found. The amygdala registered the number but classified it inside a framework where this is expected. This is the move. This is the exact data point you were told to anticipate. Threat responses need novelty and uncertainty to run at full amplitude. You removed both. The involuntary face has less to express, so it expresses less. When you speak, not immediately, but in your own time, the voice is the same voice you used to discuss the timeline 3 minutes ago. Same pitch, same rate. The words are measured, and they carry only what you put in them. They're watching your face for the tell. The face isn't giving them one. They've made their opening move, and they're reading silence where they expected a reaction. Their model is already requesting confirmation. It won't get any. They push the offer a second time. Not a revised offer, the same one, repackaged. They've added a framing around it now. Something about market conditions, about what others in your position have accepted, about the constraints on their side that make this figure a reasonable place to start. The additional language is not negotiation. It's the prediction machine running the input again at higher volume after the first pass produced no readable output. They're not making a new argument. They're hoping the argument lands differently this time, because there's more of it. You let it finish. You don't track the additional framing with small acknowledgement nods. Don't let the face register the specific points where the argument is weakest. Don't provide the micro-confirmation signals that tell a speaker their words are landing with weight. The wall on your side is the same wall it was 30 seconds ago. The offer sits in the room, fully present, unaddressed. This is where Checkpoint 5 does its work in real time. You know exactly what your body is doing. The anterior insula has been sending readings since the first offer arrived. The chest, the gut, the subtle tension in the jaw, and because you've been running the interoceptive practice long enough, those readings are available to you as precise information rather than as undifferentiated urgency. You know the intensity. You know it's within the range you've sat in before. You're routing it, not managing it, which means none of the effort of management is visible in the outputs. You give them nothing after the second framing. No nod, no shift in the chair, no repositioning of the hands that would signal an internal response to what was just said. Their nervous system is now running the error signal on 2 consecutive missed confirmations, and the escalation is about to arrive with a different quality than the earlier ones. Sharper, slightly more personal, the move transitioning from a standard opening play into something that's starting to cost them. The edge in the voice arrives before the words do. I'm not sure you're seeing the full picture here. They say, and the implication is left unstated but unmistakable, that your silence means you don't understand the parameters, or don't have the authority to respond, or aren't operating from a realistic position. This is the burst, beginning. The move has changed shape because the original shape stopped producing. They're looking for a new angle, and the new angle is designed to trigger a defensive response rather than a reactive one, to make you feel the need to establish something, prove something, demonstrate that you do understand and you do have the authority and your position is entirely realistic. You speak for the first time since the offer landed. The pitch is identical to the pleasantries at the opening. The rate is the same. The sentence is short and carries exactly one piece of information, a figure, your figure, stated plainly, without the infrastructure of justification around it. Not because the justification doesn't exist, because wrapping a number in explanation signals that you expect the number to need defending. You stated it the way you'd state the time of day. It's the number. It's accurate. The conversation can proceed from there. The silence after your counter is yours this time, held deliberately. 4 seconds is enough. They expected a longer statement, a case being made, something to push back against. They have 1 number and 4 seconds of quiet. Their body delivers the third thing before their voice does. A recalibration, the specific quality of pause that arrives when a system's working model has produced an unexpected output and needs a moment to decide what to do with it. The chest has moved, the breath has climbed, the face is doing something slightly different than it was doing when they believed they held the position. They revise, not dramatically. A percentage point, then another, offered as a concession, framed as generosity. The framing is automatic, the nervous system trying to recover the appearance of control over a concession it didn't choose to make. But the concession is real, and you didn't make a single argument to produce it. The model broke. You watched it happen from 12 inches away. A negotiation is clean. 2 parties, a defined session, a clear endpoint. You know the move is coming, you prepare for it, you hold through it, and the interaction has a boundary. The chronic version doesn't have a boundary. It's the colleague 2 desks over who has been landing the same low-grade provocation for 8 months. The manager who frames every public question to you in a way that positions your competence as uncertain. The person whose entire approach to you has been calibrated over dozens of interactions, each one producing a small confirmation, the model getting stronger and more precise with every round. That's a different problem. The model in the chronic case isn't a working hypothesis they're testing. It's a trained reflex. They don't consciously decide to run the move, the cue appears, and the behavior follows automatically. The way a route you've driven 1,000 times stops requiring navigation. The pattern has been reinforced so many times it's become infrastructure. And infrastructure takes longer to dismantle than a single bad offer in a single room. This changes the timeline. In a negotiation, the burst can arrive within the first hour. In a chronic dynamic, the first time you hold produces almost no visible effect. And if you're reading the room for immediate feedback, you'll conclude nothing happened. That conclusion is wrong. Something happened. It just happened inside their model, not in their behavior. And their behavior is still running on the previous week's data. The first hold is information you're giving the model, not the person. The model receives one anomalous input and does what any well-trained prediction system does with a single outlier. It discounts it. Their nervous system has 60+ confirmations on file. One missed return doesn't register as a pattern change. It registers as noise. They'll assume the move didn't land cleanly that day. Different context, different room. You were distracted. The model doesn't update. They try again next time with full confidence. The second hold is where the model starts to question itself. One anomaly is noise. Two anomalies in sequence is a possible signal. The behavior might arrive with slightly more deliberateness than usual, a small increase in the precision of the delivery, an almost imperceptible adjustment in timing because the system is running the input more carefully than it did before. This isn't escalation yet. It's the model conducting a recheck. The right response is exactly what it was at round one, nothing that can be used. The third time is the test, and you need to understand what that word means in this context before it arrives. The third hold triggers the burst, but in a chronic dynamic, the burst doesn't look like a clean escalation the way it did in the negotiation room. It comes with social scaffolding. There are other people present. The move is harder, more pointed, delivered in a context where your silence or your response will be witnessed and interpreted. This is not accidental. The system that has failed twice is trying to reintroduce the social cost variable that made the move reliable in the first place. The pressure of an audience, the implication of what it looks like if you don't respond. You hold through it the same way you held through rounds 1 and 2. The audience doesn't change what you give the model. The model gets the same output it's been getting. Nothing. What changes after the third hold is the texture of how they approach you, not a dramatic shift. The chronic pattern doesn't collapse the way a single-session negotiation does. It degrades. The casual low-cost probe disappears first, because the system stops generating the impulse before it can assemble the move. Then the deliberate version starts arriving less frequently, and with less precision, and eventually not at all. The model isn't being rebuilt, it's losing funding. The behavior that required dozens of confirmations to become automatic now requires dozens of misses to become unreliable, and the misses are accumulating. 4 or 5 interactions after the third hold, the dynamic feels different. Not resolved, not declared over, just different. The targeting has dropped out of their approach. You've become, in operational terms, a position they've stopped contesting. The hardest version of this isn't a negotiation room with 2 parties and a defined endpoint, and it isn't a chronic pattern you can work through across 5 or 6 private interactions. The hardest version is when the move lands in front of other people, and the other people are the mechanism. Picture a meeting. 8 people around a table, and someone directs a question at you not because they want the answer, but because the framing of the question is the move. The question implies something about your judgment, or your preparation, or whether you actually belong in the room at the level you're occupying. It's not a direct attack. It doesn't need to be. The implication is enough, and the audience does the rest. 8 sets of eyes shift toward you, and the social pressure that arrives in that shift is not metaphorical. It is a measurable physiological load. The threat circuitry responds to social evaluation the same way it responds to physical danger, activating the same fast pathway response that Ledoux documented, the same prefrontal suppression that Arnstein's work established. The room is not passive. The room is the weapon. What the provoker is counting on is a specific chain reaction. The social evaluation pressure spikes your arousal. The spike narrows your detection gap. The narrowed gap lets something through a shift in the face, a too quick response. a defensive edge in the voice, and the audience reads it before you've processed that it happened. The reaction doesn't have to be dramatic. A single visible tell in front of 8 people does more damage to the model you're trying to protect than 10 private reactions would. Everyone in the room just updated their read of you simultaneously, and the provoker didn't have to say anything beyond the question. This is why the public scenario requires the wall to already be structural, not situational. You cannot build it in the moment the question lands. The arousal arrives too fast, the social load is too high, and the prefrontal resources required to construct a real-time composure strategy are exactly the resources the environment is designed to suppress. If the breath conditioning isn't already running below conscious attention, the question lands and the chest climbs before you can decide not to let it. If the detection gap hasn't been widened through weeks of interoceptive practice, the expression assembles before the voluntary system has time to organize a counter. The audience sees it. The model gets confirmed in front of witnesses, which makes it more durable than any private confirmation could. But here's what changes when the wall is already built. The social evaluation pressure arrives, and the system absorbs it at baseline. Not because you're suppressing the response to the audience, because the arousal that the audience was supposed to amplify is already being processed inside a nervous system running at a higher regulatory capacity than it was 6 weeks ago. The 8 sets of eyes shift toward you, and the breath doesn't move. The face stays coherent. When you speak at the same pitch and rate you used before the question landed, and the audience, which was primed to watch for a tell, gets nothing to confirm. The provoker is now in a specific and uncomfortable position. The move that was designed to use the room against you has instead exposed their own strategy to the room. They asked a loaded question and got a clean answer delivered at baseline. And the 8 people who were watching the exchange read that asymmetry accurately, even without being able to articulate what they were reading. The person who asked the question looks like they were trying something. You look like someone who didn't notice or didn't care, which reads from the outside as exactly the same thing and is more damaging to their position than a direct counter would have been. The audience wasn't passive. It was always going to read the exchange and update its model of both of you. The only variable was which of you gave it something to read. You gave them nothing. They gave the audience everything. The room decides who won before anyone has spoken another word, and it decides based on exactly the data both of you just transmitted. There's a particular kind of person you've probably encountered at some point in your life. You might not have had language for what made them different. They weren't the loudest, and that's not the distinction worth making here. They weren't the most visibly confident in the performed sense, the person who fills every silence with the sound of their own certainty, who reads dominance as volume, who treats every interaction as an opportunity to establish something. That type is everywhere, and they're easy to read because they're constantly transmitting. What you noticed about this person was something closer to the opposite of that. They occupied whatever room they were in without appearing to occupy it intentionally. The conversation moved around them and they didn't redirect it, didn't angle for position, didn't use the architecture of the interaction to communicate something about themselves. And yet when they spoke, the room adjusted. Not because they demanded adjustment, because the contrast between how they were operating and how everyone else was operating made the room want to understand what they knew, that the room didn't. What they knew was not a secret. It wasn't temperament, and it wasn't the cold calculation of someone who learned to perform stillness as a social strategy. It was something more structural than either of those things, and it's the thing you've been building toward this whole time. They had sealed the leaks. Not partially, not the first 4 checkpoints, and then a visible tell at checkpoint 5. All 7, running simultaneously, not as acts of will but as conditioned outputs of a nervous system that had been trained to that baseline over enough repetitions that the training had become architecture. The detection gap was wide enough that the amygdala's fast path signal arrived and cleared before expression could assemble. The breath was sitting low enough that the stress response didn't have room to move it visibly. The HRV was high enough that the regulatory capacity the situation was trying to consume was replaced faster than it could be depleted. The face was coherent because the upstream signal had been reduced at the source through weeks of cognitive reappraisal before entering rooms like that one. The interoceptive awareness was precise enough that they were reading their own internal state in real time, routing what they caught before it exited the body. The still face they presented to anyone who expected a reaction withdrew exactly the data those nervous systems were counting on. And when silence was the right instrument, they held it at the same depth and for the same duration, whether the audience was 2 people or 12, because the discomfort of silence had been progressively trained down to a level the regulatory system could absorb without broadcasting. 7 channels, 1 wall, and the person on the other side of it, with a working model that had just been handed a confirmation it couldn't process. You have all of that now, and not as intuition about a phenomenon you couldn't name, as mechanism. You know, the push for a reaction isn't a conscious calculation, but a dopamine circuit, running a sequence your past reactions funded. You know that when the reward stops, the circuit doesn't quit. It fires a prediction error the brain treats as an emergency, and the behavior spikes before it dies. You know the burst is the countdown, not the score, and that one more round of stillness after it collapses, the model for good. You know willpower isn't the method, because the prefrontal system that would execute it is the exact system. Acute stress takes offline, which is why the wall has to be built in the weeks before the room and not summoned inside it. And you know what waits on the other side of the collapse. Not victory. The removal of a drain you'd been running so long it felt like baseline. The quiet of a background process finally shutting off. That is structural knowledge, and it changes what's available to you before you ever walk through the door. But there's one more thing worth saying before this ends, and it doesn't require a study citation or a named researcher to make it land. The person who built the wall that you've been learning to build, the one in the room whose stillness made the room want to understand what they knew, wasn't operating from a position of not feeling anything. That's the version of this that the popular imagination produces, and it's wrong in a way that matters. The cold person who feels nothing is not the model. That person is a system running at low resolution. They're not processing the information the situation is generating, which means they're not actually using the wall. They just happen to be running on a register that doesn't produce visible output. That's not power. That's absence dressed as control. And experienced readers of people can feel the difference. The absence of signal from a genuinely flat system reads differently than the absence of signal from a fully loaded system running at baseline. What you're building is the second thing. The signals arrive. The amygdala fires at full intensity when the move lands, because you're not neurologically damaged, and the fast path response to a threat is not something you're trying to eliminate. The stress response runs. The interoceptive readings come through. The body generates everything it was going to generate. The difference is that the detection gap is wide enough to catch the signal before expression. The regulatory capacity is high enough to route it. And the reappraisal installed before the room means the amygdala is classifying the threat inside a framework that reduces its amplitude before the output assembles. You feel everything. It just doesn't exit. And that distinction between the person who feels nothing and the person who feels everything without it exiting is the distinction the person across the table is trying to detect. Because the person who feels nothing is predictable in a different way. Their flat response doesn't confirm or deny the model. It just doesn't interact with it. The person who feels everything without it exiting is doing something the nervous system of the observer finds genuinely disorienting. The expected signal isn't absent because the system is offline. The system is clearly running. The signal is being processed, and the output isn't coming anyway. That disorientation is the mechanism of the power transfer. Not fear, not respect in the declarative sense. A specific form of social uncertainty that the observer's nervous system generates when it cannot build a reliable model of your behavior from your outputs. Because your outputs don't match the internal state, the observer is trying to infer. They're not reading silence. They're reading the absence of the confirmation they needed, and the absence is louder than anything you could have said. Now, hold this image. A room. 2 people. One of them came in with a move, a specific, practiced, historically successful move that has worked on versions of you before, and that they have every reason to expect will work again today. They've run the model. They've confirmed the pattern. The prediction circuit is primed, and the reward is already being anticipated before the provocation has been delivered. The provocation lands, and the room does something neither of them planned. It gets quiet. Not the tight silence of a person holding something back with visible effort, the jaw set, the breath controlled in a way the body can't quite disguise, the micro-expression leaking at the corners of the face. Not the strategic quiet of someone who read a piece of advice about counting to 5 before responding. Just quiet. The specific, still quality of a person who has nowhere they need to be and nothing they need to prove in this particular moment. Someone whose system absorbed the provocation at baseline and returned to baseline without the transition being visible in any of the 7 channels. The other person is watching, consciously or not. The other person is now in the condition we've spent this whole video mapping. The prediction circuit is running an error signal. The model is requesting a confirmation that isn't arriving. The behavior that was calibrated against a version of you that no longer exists is finding no surface to land on. And the nervous system, which has no protocol for "the model is simply wrong," starts doing the only thing it can do. It increases the pressure, then it recalibrates, then it withdraws. And somewhere in that sequence, it writes a new classification for you that it won't update again. Without data you won't be providing. The status transfer doesn't require you to say anything else. The room has already read it. The other people in the environment, if there are any, have already updated their models of both of you based on what the exchange just transmitted. The provoker made a move. The move produced nothing. The nothing was clean, and clean nothing from a fully loaded system reads as something very specific to everyone who observed it. You left them nothing to run. That's the whole thing. It doesn't feel the way the popular imagination of power feels. There's no moment of visible triumph. No exchange you can replay and point to as the one where the dynamic shifted. The shift already happened, somewhere in the gap between the provocation and the response that didn't come. In the second of silence, that was just slightly longer than the observer's nervous system could comfortably absorb. In the face that gave them nothing to triangulate against. In the voice that was carrying the same frequency it carried at the opening of the conversation and would carry again at the close. What you built isn't a technique. It isn't a script or a protocol or a set of behavioral rules to apply in the moment of pressure. What you built is a different default. A nervous system that processes threat at a higher regulatory capacity than it used to, that catches its own signals earlier than it used to, that holds silence longer than it used to, that runs the reappraisal before the room instead of scrambling for one inside it. The wall isn't something you put up, it's something you become. And the person who has become the wall doesn't have to do anything in that room. The doing is already done. The weeks of resonance breathing before the conversation, the daily body scans that pushed the detection gap wider, one layer at a time, the progressive silence practice that trained the discomfort of stillness down to a manageable signal, the pre-frame installed at the door that reclassified the room from threat to data problem before anyone in it had spoken a word. All of that happened before the provocation landed, and all of it is running now without conscious direction, below the level of attention, the way a conditioned motor pattern runs below the level of attention. What's left for the person on the other side of the table is an encounter with something their model wasn't built for, a version of you that doesn't participate in the bet. The bet required your reaction. It was funded by your reaction. Every confirmation you gave it in the months or years or interactions before today trained the prediction circuit to expect more of the same. And the expectation is the thing that makes the circuit vulnerable when the confirmation stops arriving. You didn't just withhold a reaction. You withdrew the fuel source for an entire system that has been running on you. And a system that loses its fuel source doesn't switch to an alternative gracefully. It escalates, then it panics, then it goes quiet in the specific way of a machine that has run out of input and has stopped generating output. They go quiet. The room notices. And the model of you that lives in everyone who observed the exchange is now a model of someone whose outputs cannot be predicted by the standard inputs. That model is durable. It's not something they update with one new data point. You would have to hand them new data, the old reaction, the old confirmation, the visible tell that reestablishes you as readable, and you're not going to do that because you understand now what providing that data actually costs. It costs the model they've already built. The one that says, you're outside their system. That's a position you don't vacate lightly, not for the discomfort of the silence, not for the burn of the escalation, not for the social pressure of the audience, or the accumulated weight of the chronic dynamic, or the specific heat of the extinction, burst arriving at round 4, with more force than the first 3 combined. You felt that heat before. You know what it is now. It's the last bid. It's the prediction machine spending its reserves on one more attempt before the model collapses. The hardest push is also the last one. You hold through it, and there are no more rounds. One more round of stillness. That's all it ever takes. Once the wall is built, and the burst is recognized, and the moment of maximum escalation is correctly identified as the countdown and not the score. One more round, delivered at the same depth and the same pitch, and the same quality of silence that has characterized every round before it. No visible acknowledgement that this one was different, because from your side of the wall it wasn't. The model breaks and the room shifts, and the other person has to rebuild from scratch using data you won't give them. There is one last thing. The framework you've learned here is cold. It was designed to be cold. The research it rests on is cold. Neuroscience is not a warm field. Prediction error is not a warm concept. And the dopamine circuit doesn't care about anyone's feelings, including yours. The language you have now is the language of systems and checkpoints, and regulatory capacity and prediction models, and extinction bursts. It's the language of mechanism, and mechanism is the only register that holds up when the pressure is actually present. Self-help language dissolves under load. Mechanism doesn't. But mechanism is a description of what happens, not a statement about why you're doing it. And the why is worth being direct about. You're not building this because you want to be colder than the people around you. You're not building it because indifference is the goal, or because human connection is the enemy, or because the model of success is a person who feels nothing and gives nothing, and sits behind an impenetrable wall, generating nothing. But prediction errors in the people who try to interact with them. That person exists, and they're not the model. The person who genuinely feels nothing is also the person who has nothing to offer when a situation requires something other than a wall. That's a different kind of limitation. What you're building is something more precise than that. You're building the capacity to remain inside your own system, under pressure. To process the information, a high-stakes situation generates the threat signals, the social data, the real-time readings of the people across from you, without the processing cost being visible in your outputs. To stay inside a difficult conversation without a portion of your attention consumed by the management of your own responses. To hold the stillness, not because you've numbed yourself to the thing on the other side of it, but because the regulatory capacity that stillness requires has been trained high enough that holding it doesn't consume everything you have. That capacity is not a performance tool, it's a clarity tool. The person who can sit in a room without broadcasting their internal state, without being moved by every social pressure the environment generates, without needing the interaction to resolve in a particular way before they're willing to be still, that person sees the room more accurately than anyone else in it. They're not distracted by their own outputs. They're not occupied with managing the impression they're creating. They're just watching, and the watching produces information that nobody else in the room has access to, because everyone else is too busy transmitting to receive anything cleanly. The composure is the clarity. They're the same thing, built from the same training, running on the same substrate. The wall that denies the other person their confirmation is the same wall that gives you a clear view of what they're doing while they try to get it. The silence that creates a data vacuum for their nervous system is the same silence that lets you read the cascade of signals they produce while they fill it. The regulated system that doesn't broadcast its state is the same system that reads their state accurately, because it isn't running the kind of processing load that degrades perception. This is why the framework is called what it's called. Not because calm is a passive state you achieve by going soft, because calm is an active, strategic position that produces information while denying it, that receives while not transmitting, that operates on the accurate picture of a room while everyone else in the room is operating on assumptions. Weaponized calm is not composure as a coping mechanism. It's composure as an offensive capability. The difference is not rhetorical, it's structural. Coping composure is what you practice, so the pressure doesn't destroy you. Offensive composure is what you practice, so the pressure produces an outcome that serves you, one that the other party's nervous system generates through its own prediction error responses. Without you having to direct it, you give them nothing to read. Their system tries to generate the missing data by increasing output. The increased output confirms the error and deepens the collapse. The collapse transfers the position. The position is yours, and it's durable. You didn't do anything except refuse to participate in the bet they were running. Refusal isn't a feeling. It isn't a decision you make in the moment under load. It's a conditioned output of a system that has been trained to a baseline where the bet has nothing to grab onto. The wall is already up when you open the door. The detection gap is already wide. The breath is already low. The regulatory capacity is already running. The reappraisal is already in place. The silence tolerance is already extended past the point where their model expected you to break. You're not preparing for the room. You are the preparation. And the person on the other side of the table, running the move that has worked on every version of you they've encountered before they're about to meet the version that was built in the weeks before today. In the daily practice sessions, and the progressive silence drills, and the resonance breathing, and the body scans, and the pre-frame at the door, they're going to run the model and get nothing back. Then they're going to run it again, harder. And then they're going to sit in the specific discomfort of an environment where their instruments don't produce readings. And they're going to withdraw. And the room is going to notice that they withdrew. And the status that transfers in that withdrawal is not something they can reclaim by deciding to try again. You didn't win by doing more. You won by building, before the room, the thing that makes doing less the dominant position. Think about that person again. The one you noticed at some point in your life, in some room you both occupied, whose stillness made the room want to understand what they knew. You're building toward what they had. You're not all the way there yet. The training takes time. The detection gap closes back in when the load spikes before the HRV has been conditioned high enough. The silence breaks before it should, when the social pressure arrives in the form of an audience. The burst hits at round 4, and the response exits before the rational framing can catch it. That's not failure. That's the gap between the current baseline and the trained one. And the gap closes with practice the same way every other physical gap closes. Repetition, load, recovery, repetition. 8 weeks of consistent practice produced measurable structural changes in the brains of the people in Lazar's study and Holzel's study. The alarm got quieter, the brake got stronger, the instrument panel got more precise. Those are not metaphors. Those are measured changes in gray matter density and cortical thickness, documented in peer-reviewed journals by researchers who spent careers studying the physical substrate of what you're training. The wall is not a psychological construct. It's a physiological one. It responds to load the same way every other physical system responds to load. You apply the load, and the system adapts. The baseline rises. The detection gap widens. The regulatory capacity increases. The conditioned default output under pressure stops being react and starts being absorb and root. The training doesn't make you different in some abstract sense. It makes you physically different in the systems that determine your outputs under load. And one day, you'll walk into a room. It won't look like that bare lab in Trier in 1993, except in the one way that matters. This time, you're not the one in the chair. You're behind the table, one of the still faces that give nothing back. The wall that Clemens Kirschbaum and Dirk Hellhammer spent their careers learning to measure. Someone has been running the same move on you for months, expecting the same output they've always gotten, the prediction circuit, already anticipating the confirmation before the provocation lands. The move will land. Something will fire. And what exits the body will be nothing anyone across the table can use. The model will request confirmation. The confirmation won't come. And somewhere in the silence that follows, in the gap between the provocation and the response that doesn't arrive, in the 4 seconds that sit in the room like something solid, in the face that gives them nothing to triangulate against, and the voice that carries the same frequency it carried at the start of the conversation, the bet goes bad. Not with fanfare. Not with the dramatic shift in a room's gravity that the popular imagination of power produces. Just quietly. The way a machine goes quiet when the input stops arriving and the prediction circuit has nothing left to run. They'll try once more. They'll make one harder push, the burst arriving with everything the model has left. The escalation carrying the specific urgency of a system that has been running prediction error long enough to understand on some pre-verbal level that the model is in trouble. You'll feel it arrive. You'll know what it is. and you'll hold. One more round. After that, the room is yours. It was always going to be yours. You just had to build the thing that makes it that way before you walked into it. That building started today.